Buongiorno, buongiorno a tutte e a tutti. It's a full room. I'm glad you're all here. And today we move on to scientific stuff. Not that history is a kind of science, but not in the same way as we are talking about sciences today. We're talking about gendered innovations, and we have the pleasure of having Londa Shibinger here. I will introduce her with great admiration and respect, and I'm not surprised that people around the world look at Londa Shibinger as a kind of guru, as an inspiring figure in science, but also in many other ways. And the ways that she inspired me, for example, was at a moment when I'm a humanist, right? I teach literature and postcolonial studies, and these are the things that I work with. But there was a moment a few years ago when the humanities looked as if they had no meaning at all. Everything was science and technology, and it felt, even in our universities, that all the money and the attention went to the hard sciences, and the humanities were not cared for or actually allowed to express their full meaning. So when actually my colleague, where is Silvana? There. Silvana Badaloni said, I met Londa Shibinger and she is a really interesting person and she's doing great things. I looked into this and I realized that Londa had the courage and the vision to look outside the strict borders of our disciplines and experiment. And the idea that the humanities actually can fertilize a whole series of other knowledges and other research or scientific interests is a great move forward and a great way of seeing how knowledge has always been interconnected and in its different disciplines need to speak to one another. And I think, and we saw it even yesterday when Alessandro Fabri spoke about his research. He's the student we actually awarded with the Elena Cornaro Prize. If ethics were not there, his own questioning of science and technology and artificial intelligence, well, we would lose much of our humanity. So this is why we wanted to have Londa here today. And I'm very glad she crossed all the way from Stanford to here for just 2 days. And we very much appreciate that. Thank you. So as a humanist, I'm reading her curriculum. It would take ages, but I'll take it short and I'll just give you the highlights. Londa Shibinger is the John Heinz Professor of History of Science at Stanford University. One thing I forgot is that, sorry, I wanted to say before I read your CV is that you need to ask the right questions, right? We all need to ask the right questions, the questions that matter in whatever kind of field you are working. And I think Londa Shibinger asked the new questions and the right questions at a moment when these questions were needed. And that made a huge difference. So I invite all the students here to think about the questions that matter in their study and in their job. Okay, Londa is the founding director of Gendered Innovations in Science, Health and Medicine, Engineering and Environment. She's a leading international expert on gender in science and technology and has addressed the United Nations, the European Parliament, and numerous funding agencies on the topic. Shubhengi received a PhD from Harvard University and is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is the recipient of numerous prizes and awards, including the prestigious Alexander von Humboldt Research Prize and Guggenheim Fellowship.
How can we harness the creative power of sex, gender, and intersectional analysis for discovery? Does this approach take us in new directions? Does it add valuable dimensions to our research? So first, a bit of background. Governments and universities in the US and Western Europe have taken 3 strategic approaches to gender equality over the past several decades. The first I like to call Fix the Numbers. This focuses on increasing the numbers of women and underrepresented groups in science and engineering. It's about participation. It's about creating gender balance in research teams. It's about hiring more women at universities. These are the kinds of things that we talked about yesterday. The second is Fix the Institutions. This promotes gender equality in careers through structural change in research organizations. This is about reforming universities and research institutions so that everyone's career can flourish. And the third is Fix the Knowledge, or as I call it, Gendered Innovations, which stimulates excellence in science and technology by integrating sex, gender, and intersectional analysis into research. And here the European Commission is the leader, along with other national funding agencies, including the German Research Foundation. Now, I'm not aware that any Italian funding agencies work at this level yet. Do you have requirements that if public money is being distributed, that you must discuss the sex, the gender, the intersectional approaches in your research? If you do, I would love to know. I keep a list of such funding agencies and I will add it to the website if that is true. I just noticed I didn't have any Italian institutions there. So my talk today focuses on the third strategic approach, fixing the knowledge. It's the newest area and the most important for the future of science, innovation, and human knowledge. And this is what Gendered Innovations is all about. Now, we distinguish these fixes. Oh, good, it's not showing there, that's good. We distinguish these fixes analytically, but in reality, they work together. Although many people try to fix the numbers first, they try to recruit women or underrepresented minorities first, we will not fix the numbers until we fix the knowledge. Let me give you 2 quick examples of the links between who does science and what science is created. So using a sample of 1.5 million medical research papers, our study found a link between women's authorship and the likelihood of a study to include gender and sex analysis. These findings show the mutual benefits of promoting both the scientific advancement of women and the integration of sex and gender analysis into medical research. The second study, done by Rem Koenig at Harvard Business School, shows that if all biomedical patents filed between 1976 and 2010 had been produced equally by men and women, there would be some 6,500 more female-focused biomedical inventions, leading to biotechnologies that would benefit women. So I'm on the board of a femtech startup right now, which is extremely interesting. And this femtech was started by some of my former students. So why might this be relevant to your research? Beginning in 2020, the European Commission's Horizon Europe strengthened their gender dimension in research. Applicants are now required to integrate sex, gender, or intersectional analysis into the design of research or to justify that it's not relevant. Now, I know one of the guests here is a physicist, a theoretical physicist, and looking at gender issues in theoretical physics is not really relevant. So this, you would just note down that it is not relevant. But in most fields of science, social sciences, humanities, these kinds of issues are relevant. To support the policy, the EC held a 2-year expert group, which I directed. And this group consisted of 25 experts from numerous fields of science, from biomedicine to marine science to machine learning and environmental sciences. Our results are published here. The book is easy to find. You can download it for free, or much of the work is also loaded up on the Gendered Innovations website. Or maybe you collaborate with scholars in the US. In 2016, the US National Institutes of Health implemented their requirement that we consider sex as a biological variable and that this be included in all publicly funded research. The idea is, and this is important, the idea is that if taxpayer money is being used, the research should benefit everyone across all of society. Until now, the NIH has considered gender too complex to implement in biomedical research. But in October, the NIH held a conference online. I attended this, and they were devising strategies for implementing gender as a sociocultural variable. Over 1,000 participants attended this virtual event. And as soon as you open the door to gender, then people start talking about structural racism and all the other kinds of social determinants of health that are important to look at. So we'll see exactly what the NIH does. Now that I've set the stage, let's dive into sex, gender, and intersectional analysis in research. So first, we look at why it's so important. We know that doing research wrong costs lives and money. For example, 10 drugs were recently withdrawn from the US market because of life-threatening health effects, and 8 of those posed greater threats for women. Not only did the drugs cost billions of dollars to develop, but when they fail, they cause human death and suffering. We can't afford to get the research wrong. Or take osteoporosis. As we know, gender is not just about women. So this example is about men as well. So osteoporosis is the disease that thins the bones as people age. And because osteoporosis is considered primarily a women's disease, diagnoses and treatment for men have lagged. Yet after a certain age of about 75, men account for nearly 1/3 of the hip fractures. And tragically, when men break their hips, they tend to die, and we don't know why. Analyzing the intersection between sex and gender in osteoporosis research has developed new diagnoses for men, and the search for better treatments is underway. So we know that doing research right can then save lives and money. It's crucially important to get the research right from the very beginning. And this is the goal of Gendered Innovations. The project develops state-of-the-art methods of sex, gender, and intersectional analysis. It's very hard to boil down humanistic methods into very practical statements, but we've tried to do that. And it provides case studies or examples to illuminate, to illustrate how sex, gender, and intersectional analysis leads to discovery and innovation. So it's very important. One of the most important things you can do in your research is use the correct term, sex or gender. Sadly, researchers often confuse these terms, especially in medicine for some reason, and use them incorrectly, which makes analysis, the sorts of things I do as a social science, very difficult. So you can read all about it in this article. Now, a lot of people think of sex and gender in binary terms of male, female, man, woman, but gender is moving quickly beyond just men and women. I think you can think back to 2014 when Facebook launched 51 flavors of gender. I have to say, I'm an expert in gender stuff, but even I had to look up some of them. It was very interesting. And on the back end of all of that, they still coded it into male, female because of the way they do their advertising. So it didn't really help anything, but it was a fun moment. So this Pew research from 2022 found that 1.6 of US adults are transgender or non-binary. And among young adults under 30, it's much higher at 5%. Then you have to remember it's also higher on the coasts of the US. We have very different political areas. And the two coasts, the East and the West, are more liberal than many other places. It's also important to remember that some 15 countries globally allow a third sex category on legal documents, such as birth certificates, passports, and the like. These include Germany and India. There are others. And in the US, at least 18 states allow a third sex on legal documents. These include, of course, California. So the goal of gendered innovations is to add value to research by ensuring excellence in science. If you don't look at all the variables that are required, it's not excellent. And that's why the EC asked for these dimensions when you apply for money from them. Gendered innovations also adds value to society by making research more responsive to social needs, and it can add value to business by developing new ideas, patents, and technologies. So now let me take you through some of our case studies. As I said, doing research wrong can cost lives and money. Research can fail, and it fails more often for women and non-binary people. So let's zoom through some of the examples. Let's start with search engines. In Google search, let's say you've just graduated from Padua or some other university, and you're searching for a job. In the search results that appear, men are 5 times more likely than women to be offered ads for high-paying executive jobs. In the US, these would be jobs that pay $150,000 per year, something like that. So why is that? It has to do with the data and the search algorithm. Men in the US, on average, just men as a group, not by ethnicity or class or anything, just men as a group, earn 20% more than just women as a group. So this is an average of all men and all women, not broken down by any other factors. The algorithm has been designed to get the ad to the right person. In this case, an ad for a high-paying job would go to a man because men earn more. The algorithm can see that. And so this then perpetuates the cycle of social inequalities. But then once engineers become aware of this kind of problem, they can fix it. Another type of problem you see is with soap dispensers, or more importantly, pulse oximeters. So skin color is also important in technologies. We have to do this intersectional thing. So soap dispensers, there's a great video that really went viral for a while of 2 guys, one with white hands and one with darker hands. And the guy with the white hands puts his hand under the soap dispenser, gets the soap, washes his hands, off he goes. The black guy puts his hands under the soap dispenser, nothing happens. The white guy, soap, black guy, no soap. It keeps going like this. So it's because it's because the technology was developed by white people for white people, and always it's white people. So it's because there's a near infrared technology that sees the hand, closes the circuit, and dispenses the soap, but it doesn't work for darker skin. Now, this was very serious during COVID because the pulse oximeter was the first thing you used to see your oxygen saturation, even in emergency rooms, because then you don't have to draw real blood, right? no needles, you just use a pulse oximeter. And it's the same kind of infrared technology that sees melanin as oxygen in your blood. So it sees your oxygen level as much higher than it really is. That meant that in the United States, people with darker skin did not get the emergency oxygen they needed when they went to the hospital for COVID. So very serious situation. And if I give you just another example from car accidents, we see that belt-restrained women, so women wearing their seatbelts, are 47 times more likely than belt-restrained men to be injured in a car accident, even if you control for the height and the weight. We all know this is because crash test dummies are still taken from medium-sized males. The medium-sized male body has been the norm in medicine for hundreds of years. It's been the norm, even Tesla. I finally bought a Tesla, and you can be sure they stuffed a mid-sized engineer, male engineer, right into that driver's seat because it doesn't fit me very well. The visor is the wrong height. It just doesn't fit me. But, you know, it's a fun car. So anyway. So each of these examples is important. But what did you notice about them? Each example focuses on one social dimension in isolation, either sex, as in the case of the automobile accidents, gender, as in the case of the Google search, or skin tone, as in the case of the soap dispensers. So here we need to focus on a higher level, and that's intersectionality. So what is intersectionality, and what is an intersectional approach? So intersectionality describes overlapping or intersecting forms of discrimination related to gender, sex, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, sexuality, geographic location. You can go on with these relevant social factors. The term was coined in 1989 by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how multiple forms of discrimination intersect, especially in Black women's lives. In 1989, her concern was that the white feminist movement was excluding women of color. And at the same time, the civil rights movement was excluding women. So it's a very interesting and fraught history. So let me show you how intersectionality works in facial recognition. And this is work done by Joy Buolamwini, and it's called Gender Shades. Gender Shades studies intersectionality, specifically how sex and race intersect, and show that facial recognition can't see Black women's faces. If you go back to Joy for a moment, was at that time an MIT PhD student developing facial recognition, and her program couldn't see her own face. So she put on a white mask, and sure enough, it could see her face, but her real face, it could not see. So she did a smart woman. She does a study of this for her MIT PhD thesis. So she calls it gender. I think maybe it's sex. We could argue about that for a little bit. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So the gender analysis shows that the system performs better, facial recognition systems perform better on men's faces than women's faces. And then separately, a race analysis shows that the system performed better on lighter skin than darker skin. But if you do the intersectional analysis, you see that the system performs worse for Black women. The error rate is 35% for darker skinned women. That's not really acceptable at all. It's then a little better, 12% error rate for darker skinned men, 7% for lighter skinned women, and 1% or almost no error rate for lighter skinned men. But wait, there's more. We can look at sexuality. Systems cannot recognize transgender faces, especially during periods of transition. And then one that's just fun, facial cosmetics, if you wear makeup, this also disrupts the facial recognition method unless it's using just the eyes, if it's using the face in general. So if you're traveling, like I am, through international borders, make sure you have the same makeup on when you arrive after 15 hours that you did when you took your passport photo. It's just a good tip. So here we have the intersectional innovation. This is Buolamwini and Gebru's intersectional innovation. They created an inclusive data set to solve these problems of the sex and race. And they took faces from public people, members of parliaments from 6 countries, 3 in Africa and 3 in Europe. But what problem do you see with this data set? My students saw it right away. There are no Asians. There are no indigenous people of the Americas, of Australia, of, well, North or South America. And so we have an innovation, and I'm sure the facial recognition then can recognize more people, but we still need more innovations. And then I should add that getting the data right is good, but we all know what the problems are with facial recognition. So I use it as the example that's been very studied, but I'm not necessarily saying that facial recognition is a good thing. I think Belgium has outlawed facial recognition completely. France and Sweden ban it in school. In San Francisco, the police aren't allowed to use it, and nor can the public transportation people. So we know that there are problems with facial recognition. Though it opens my phone and my computer, so I also like it. Okay, so we've released some tools for intersectionality. It's an intersectional design cards that we used in our D-School class, our design school class. We won a prize for them in the UK last year. We have 12 defining factors. You can see what they are here. And it helps designers. This is literally a pack of cards. I'm a historian. I would not have used cards. I kept saying cards, but the designers, they use cards. So when they're going to design a product at Google or Apple, they throw the cards on the table. They look at these 12 intersecting factors and decide, which one do I need for my product? What should I use? So we sell them at cost. Stanford distributes them, or you can just see them online there. Then I want to show you Apple's design list of design factors. So they want to empower and delight everyone because they're trying to sell you more of their phones and other things. So, but here I particularly like handedness, if you see that in the second row there. My neighbor, so at Stanford, the faculty all live on campus in houses that we have to buy, and they're very expensive and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, so all my neighbors are faculty members. One of my neighbors is a famous hand surgeon. She specializes on the thumb. But she herself is left-handed, but all the surgical instruments are designed for right-handed people. So just think how awesome she could be if the instruments fit her rather than her having to fit the instruments. So I think handedness is interesting. I think philosophical beliefs are interesting. I think there's a lot that you can get from this list as well. But the thing to remember about these kinds of lists is that both of our lists are culturally specific. They're both developed in the US, right? So I'm sure you in Italy would have wine on there somewhere, for sure. You'd have some of their other factors. And the second point you need to remember is that you start with this broad list of factors, but then to do anything in particular, you narrow it down like any field of research. Now, I think maybe I can do one more example because my time was eaten away at the beginning by Italian time. So I'm going to do one, I'll leave out one of my examples, but let me do one more example, and that has to do with pain. Pain has both biological aspects. This is how sex and gender interact. So we can look at intersectionality with all kinds of social factors, but one really basic one is how sex and gender interact in human bodies, really, because we always, all of us always have sex and gender. So pain is has both biological aspects, that is to say, sex differences in the electrical, ischemic, and thermal pressure and muscle pain sensitive, and it has cultural aspects. The gender factors in how people report pain and how physicians understand and treat pain in patients. So here is the biological picture that we start with. Researchers describe the pain pathway here in mice, and they discovered that it's mediated between when you feel it and in your brain by the microglia here. I guess my thing, yeah, the microglia here. And then they realized that they had used all male mice, these researchers. So they thought, okay, we better look at this in females too. And then they found the microglia doesn't do anything. The whole story is about the T cells. So there is what we might call a male pathway of pain and a female pathway of pain, but not so fast because other factors can disrupt these pathways. Males who lack testosterone, or to say older males, may switch over to this more female pathway, and females who are pregnant, and I'm not quite sure how this works, switch over to the more male pathway. So it's not so clear that sex is all that binary, but it's way more complicated than that. Pain also has cultural aspects. Gender factors into how people report pain and how physicians understand and treat pain in patients. So there's gender identity, which may influence a person's willingness to report pain. There's gender norms that may influence how people actually feel pain. And there's gender relations, and that's how people report the pain to their physician. So the relationship between the person with pain and the physician who is hearing about the pain. And here you see this system in motion here. You have the patient who can be a man, woman, a non-binary person, a gender diverse person. You have the physician who can be any of those things, and you have the treatment. So here the patient has a sex, has a genetics and hormones, has the physical feeling of pain, and they have gender. They have the cultural aspects of pain. And so they're going to express their pain to their physician. So with gender norms, as I said, some people may not be as willing to express their pain. So for example, gender stereotypes in many cultures expect men to be strong and resolute. And this means that men are maybe less willing to express their pain than are women. And this, of course, can vary by ethnicity and by many other social factors. Then there's the physician. Now, this can be a man, a woman, a gender diverse person, any of those. The physician then hears how that physician thinks the person is expressing pain and orders a treatment. But these treatments can be based on gender stereotypes and behaviors as held by the physician. So it's true that physicians often perceive women's pain as psychological rather than as real, and therefore women receive fewer pain medicines than men receive. So we see that the treatment of pain can be based very much on these gender norms as much as on the person's real sense of pain. Now, we would like in our on our website to make this more intersectional so that we look at race and ethnicity. So then this image is going to get really messy. If we add race and ethnicity and migration status, maybe class issues, then it's going to be very hard to have a schematic, but that's what real life is like. Okay, so I wanted to quickly introduce marine organisms because I had the pleasure of having Elena Gysi as part of my group at Stanford and also at the Marine Study Center there, but I'm going to leave that aside because we're running out of time. And I would like to take you live to my website if we can do that. Okay, now I'll ask the can we get the website up? Hello, technology people, maybe this. Maybe that? No, just for a second. I know my time is, running out. Oh, it came up. I think you just walking up here intimidated it. Yes. Okay, great. So this is the website where we have all of our information. We have our general methods, which include analyzing gender. So you can look at this here. We emphasize that it goes through the whole research process. It's not just the data you use. It's not just what question you ask. And then we give some of the best, latest information for how do you think about analyzing gender when identifying the problem? How do you think about it when you're designing your research, and so on and so forth. We do that for sex also, and intersectionality. And then these are our case studies. I didn't give you a bunch of them. I love the, well, my new favorite one is domestic robots, but I love the gendering social robots, haptic touch. Who knew we humans had so many rules about touching, and what will robots do when they start touching you? But what I wanted to do was look for just a minute at the policy recommendations. So we have recommendations here because as a historian of science, if I want to create social change, I need to think about science infrastructure and how does it work. And we know that we have to change the funding agencies, and we have to change the peer reviewed journals. We have a lot going on there. And then all of us, you and myself as well, are at universities. We're doing the very worst job of all of these people, the funding agencies and the peer reviewed journals. We are not including sex and gender in all the courses where it's relevant at the university. So we need to do more work. I teach gendered innovations as a separate course in the history department. That means that computer science have to come and find me. That means that pre-med people have to come and find me. We aren't teaching these things just throughout the entire curriculum. So it's important to think about the whole science infrastructure and how we can tug it and poke it and integrate sex and gender analysis throughout the whole system. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Londa. Very inspiring description of what you've produced.
Yeah, just leave it for, oh, you want to switch to the other, you can do that. Go ahead.
Okay, what you produced through these last few years and the amount of intersectional knowledge that you produced through your research is amazing. And I think what I gather from your inspiring talk is, yes, it actually means we are all different, and that's commonplace kind of statement. But also, I'll move it a little bit forward to a remark that I got from a scholar, an African scholar, and we were discussing race rather than gender. And Achille Mbembe said, you know, what we share is our difference. So really looking for similarities is hopeless if you really want to have a full look at humanity, and also to, you know, fertilize science with this. I understand the messy thing, because it becomes really messy when you look at not so much, you know, the heteronormative model and the stereotypes that go with it. But if you leave that aside, your eyes open, and you can actually relate to human beings rather than men and women and, you know, blacks and whites and so on. So it's really producing a new way of looking at humanity that is everywhere in the humanities, in the sciences, in sociology, in the institutions. And I hope my students had a very clear idea of what it means for the future. I'm opening the floor to questions and comments now, if there are any. I hope there are. Who's going first? Yes, Lorenzo, please. Yeah. You should switch it on. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. First, I apologize because it turns out I've left my regular glasses at home, so I have to keep these. I'm sorry.
Just a cool guy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I wanted to ask you an epistemological question regarding not only how sex and gender should and can and should be incorporated into science, but also about how gender and sex can affect and condition science. Because I don't know if you agree, but I would say that science is about, let's say, discovery and creation at the same time. And the two things are actually undistinguishable, where discovery is something objectivity, and creation involves a subjective side. And as we all know, the classical sexist discourse would say, well, people like women are unable to do science because they are too much conditioned by their subjective experience, right? By their body, etc. Whereas science requires neutrality. And many feminists objected not by saying, okay, we can be as neutral as you men are, but they said, yes, we are. Conditioned by our subjective experience as women. And of course, the same can be said of disabled people, racialized people. So yeah, women said, yeah, our subjective experience counts, but it counts in a positive way. So I was just wondering, that's the question, if during your project you had the opportunity to collect data regarding this. That's my curiosity. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I have a lot to say about this question. So men are as subjective as women, of course, and the whole project has been to make science objective. And especially in the 1990s, there was a lot of work to show how science is influenced by culture, by the people, by the political situation, by all of culture. And in effort, a lot of people just say, well, science isn't objective. So, but my position is that objectivity is a goal for science. And what we need to do as scientists of whatever type is to try to reach that goal, to understand our own subjectivity and and the subjectivity of our instruments, the subjectivity of our funding schemes, the subjectivity of our institutions, all of that, and to see nature as it is in relationship to us as well. And I don't think there's a difference between men and women in that way. Men and women have different social experience, and therefore they bring new experiences to the academy, which has excluded women and a whole set of values along with women, such as subjectivity and feeling and all the things that are not reason, what we were talking about yesterday. So women are not, the brain is not different. Women aren't different than men as scientists, and it's a matter of our social experience. So the reason you may think women do science differently, which was also a famous thing in the late 90s, women do science differently. It's true that any newcomer to the academy brings new questions. So I just did a paper, one of these big data papers, which I don't personally do, but I have people I work with to do the big data, on the field of history itself. And through topic modeling, we were able to show the correlation between women coming into the discipline of history and the rise of women's history and eventually gender history. So without, I don't know, can I really say that? But I'll say it. Without women coming into the academy, we wouldn't have something called gendered history or gender studies for that matter. But it doesn't have to do with a different way of thinking that women have. It has to do with the kind of social experience that women have. So if we look at gender history, it's simply, okay, sure, Napoleon did a whole bunch of wars and he brought, great grid-like streets to a lot of places in the world. But women were doing a whole bunch to support those wars at the same time, right? Whenever there's a war, there are a lot of women in the camp behind that's doing the soldiers' laundry and cooking food and keeping the soldiers all going. So it's not just that there's men doing great actions, the whole society is working together, and you have to see what the role would be for the men or women at any particular time. So that's my view on that. And I could write more, I could, read forth several more books on that.
So thank you for a wonderful paper, a really stimulating paper. My question is, as we know, there is a militant anti-science politics that is affecting public policy, how we educate at every level, from elementary school to the university, even what can be said aloud. And this is not only in the United States, it's worldwide. And so I'm wondering, the work of your institute that is supposed to have a direct benefit in terms of society, the kinds of science that's practiced, how are you in your institute talking to those outside of the sort of progressive sphere and making an impact? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, I guess my strategy is always to have priorities. And my priorities are to talk to the very serious scientists who are producing, our space shots and our new medicines, our vaccines for COVID and all that sort of thing, and to see that they do the science correctly. And I'm just gonna, so I don't anymore study the participation of women in science because it's just too much. So I'm very good at leaving aside things so I can focus on what I feel is exciting and important. And US politics, I mean, my two sons now both teach at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And if it gets much worse in the US, I'll just leave. There's no hope for the Republicans. There's no hope for people you cannot, for me, there's no hope for people you cannot have a reasonable conversation with. So if they want to destroy abortion and destroy everything we worked for, well, yeah, somebody else has to take up that fight. Mine is to make sure that your COVID vaccines work. And look, we're all here without masks. They're working.
The worrying thing for me is that it's not just the US that is going that way. We're going that way in Europe as well. It doesn't look good at all.
It does not look good.
So we all go to British Columbia. Maybe we all move to Canada. Okay, more questions? You asked us a question at the beginning.
I did.
Okay, so if any, maybe Giovanella would like to answer how public money is spent in universities, in the public sphere of research that has provisions for sex and gender as, a rule.
Yeah, specifically if a funding agency asks for sex and gender during the application process.
You need to put it on. Thank you.
I don't know whether I'm able to answer correctly to this question. I only can tell you some story, for example, some examples. The AIFA, that is the agency for drug in Italy, has done some fund.
Can you hear?
Some years ago. Some years ago on gender difference in pharmacology. Okay, they have they gave the premium, the fund to project on gynecology.
Okay.
No? So this was really something.
Yeah. So I will not add an Italian funding agency
now
to my list.
we have other call for again for Haifa, and we hope that this time the story is changing a little, because the rumors in Italy is much, as I will tell you in a few minutes, is much stronger on this field, on gender medicine.
Good.
So,
yes.
Okay, what I can add, Claudia, okay.
Very much, Londa. It's not an answer to this, but I think it's related, and it's related to the question I wanted to pose. So the question goes back to the slide where you had the Greek temple and the different columns. And I think funding agencies is not the whole of institutions and policy making. So my question would relate to where is the space for policy making and responsibility of policymakers in taking up the responsibility and making rules for change, which is of course relevant to the whole temple to stay up. And what have been the condition, for instance, in the European context? When is it that they listen to you? Is it only when they come to you and they're asking for something they're already interested in? So what are the conditions for this dialogue between the knowledge that we create and policymaking that goes in a direction that supports this? And I'm asking this because I think in relation to what is going on in Italy now, right now, we're having all this recovery plan. Most of the project proposals, they are actually supposed to be submitted with some gender equality elements. And most of the time, what we see in projects is like a token. So you put the line or you have like 2 sentences in there, but there is no requirement as to how are you going to do this. So how do we create that connection between the policy that request that trickles down to national state dimension and how that it becomes part of the norm for those of us, developing projects and doing research, so that we are invited to say not only that we are going to do something about this, but what and how. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Claudia. So funding agencies, we did a study which was published last November in Science magazine, and it's a framework for funding agencies. So I would show it, but I'm already off here. And you can find it on our website. So if a funding agency wants to include sex, gender, or whatever other factor in a call, we have a 5-part series that you can step through to do this. So the first is definitions, and we collect all the great definitions from funding agencies in the world for sex, gender, race, ethnicity, whatever it might be. The second step is to, well, now I'm going to forget my 5 steps, but we also talk about what is in the call. How do you state the call? How do you do it quickly? The European Commission is the leader on all of this. They state the call very quickly and then have backup materials which teach you more and more. I've been involved in producing those backup materials. So how do you do the call? And then the next part is, how do you train the researchers? So we, as I said, we at the universities are not doing our job. We are not training engineers, scientists, medical people. It's a personal failing of mine that Stanford Medical School does not include sex throughout its entire curriculum. Let's not even talk about gender, just sex differences that matter so much. So how do you train the researcher until universities do their job? How can the funding agencies do it? And for medicine, there are really good online trainings from our NIH, US National Institutes of Health, and the Canadian Institutes of Health. Excellent 3-part, 4-part training series. So that's pretty easy. We don't have those training series for others. Then it's training the reviewers, because you can have a beautiful application and the reviewers don't do their job. They don't know how to do their job. And then we have another 5th part. So we walk you through how the funding agency should do this. And please have a look on the website. It's down on the left nav. There's a policy portal. And in there you see funding agencies. So funding agencies are on the front end and peer-reviewed journals are on the back end. And I'm delighted that Elsevier has now asked for sex and gender in articles from reviewers across 3,200 of their journals. So not just the medical journals anymore, but the artificial intelligence journals, the mechanical engineering journals. If the mechanical engineers did sex correctly, my Tesla car would fit me, right? And I could drive more comfortably and probably safer. So it's really great what the peer-reviewed journals are doing. So the way I make it simple, that there are three aspects: the funding agencies, the universities, and we need to do our job, and the peer-reviewed journals. There are many other aspects, but that's how you do it. And so the funding agencies make their own policy, right, in-house for their funding agency. I think I said at dinner last night, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, the German National Research Foundation, spent 2 years making their guidelines for their researchers, and they consulted many, many people in the process of doing that.
If I may add something to that quickly, as far as the funding agencies for us in the university, we can only hope that Europe keeps doing good stuff, and the policies that accompany the new Horizon distribution of research money comes with the request that whatever project is submitted by a university, it includes sex and gender issues, and not only that, but that each university has a gender equality plan, not just on paper, but working. And this is a major thing, which I hope will be taken forward by this university. We already started that. We had a gender equality plan before Europe actually asked for it. Things from that, well, there's a lot of limitations, but they don't look as bad as the plan for national recovery after COVID. We got a lot of money. We are given a lot of money, but then the only thing that the plan asks of institutions like universities, public administrations, is that they recruit at least 40% women. That's the only thing. The presence of women, which is not bad, of course, but nothing else. So there's no reasoning, there's no thinking around what that means. Only means, a recovery that takes into account many other different factors. Okay, I think we've overrun time. But unless there are one last very urgent question, I will close this session. Are there? No. Okay. Thank you very much, Londa.
Good morning to everyone, and thanks to Annalisa, to the organizing committee for giving me the opportunity to introduce you, Giovanella Baggio. I am very pleased and honored by this opportunity because I am strongly rooted to all the teaching of that Giovanella has done in all these years. Giovanella can be considered a pioneer of the gender-specific medicine. And as American used to say, you can recognize a pioneer by the arrows that he has got in the back. So, and Giovanella has struggled a lot during this year because she started with the gender medicine program about 15 years ago. And at that time, in Italy, gender medicine was reserved only to small clubs. So I think that from that, Giovanella has done indeed an amazing job, because she had the first chair of gender medicine in 2013. And then in 2009, she was the founder of the Italian Research Center for Gender Health and Medicine, and she's now the president. And as an achievement of all the efforts that he devoted to the gender medicine staff, let me just remember that Giovanella has taken part of the committee by the National Ministry of Health in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think that is a very important achievement. And Giovanella has told me before, please stay short, so I give the word. The word is yours, Giovanella. Thank you for all what you have done for this medicine. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luca. And thank you, Annalisa, and all the organizers. I am a medical doctor, and since 51 years, I see every day patients. So I will show to you, I will try to speak to you, taking a lot of examples of my patients. This is a podium prepared for men. It's not for women. It's too high. I have to put in the right because I cannot see your face. I have also to ask, sorry for my English. My very first language is French, the second is Italian. Then I've been working 3 years in Germany. And then English for me is something that I've read on the newspaper, on the paper, or scientific paper. So sometimes I invent some words. So I will try to convince that gender medicine should be no more used, and I like much more to speak about gender-specific medicine, and perhaps also in the future something different. First of all, there is no need for you. I have to underline that gender medicine is not women's disease. Gender medicine is an approach to health and to diseases of men and women at all age since the intrauterine life and then till the very long life of this. This is my patient when I was in Sardinia, the day of his 112th birthday. This, the difference between men and women is really at all ages. So gender medicine is a transversal dimension of medicine, which studies the influence of sex and gender on the human physiology, pathophysiology, and pathology. And the need, the very important need for gender medicine arises as there are too many studies which describe diseases exclusively, I will show you in a minute, focusing on one sex or in one gender. Somebody, mainly men, normally say, but women live longer, there's no problem. So I show always this slide. Life expectancy at birth in Italy by the Statistical Institute, Italian Institute, let us have a look only to the 21, was 84 for women. That means 4 years advantage, let us say advantage of women comparison to men. Okay, but if you look to this slide and you see not only the life expectancy, but this is when you are already 50 years old, but also years of health, of healthy life. Let us have a look to Italy. If you look to Italy, when you are 50, already 50, you have in front of you 30 years if you are a man, 35 years if you are a female, a woman. Okay, nothing not expected. But if you like to know how many years of healthy life you will have, there is no more difference in Italy as well as in all other countries. That means that men with health problems are far more likely to die than women with similar problems. On the other side, women live longer but suffer disability and ill health. The 4 years advantage that we have, 4.5 year advantage that we have, are not good life. This is for 90% of women, not only for 2 women overall. So it is vital to understand just how different medicine for women is compared to that for men. And for this reason, since 51 years already, I see patients every day. I will show you 5 clinical cases. This is all they are true cases. Only the picture are not taken from Google. This is Fervida, 54 years old. She has teeming pain since 2 weeks, and his family brought her to the emergency. She went to the emergency, and the emergency very quickly, very efficiently sent her to the gastroenterology. And gastroenterology very efficiently did a gastroscopy. But this lady, 54 years old, had nothing to her stomach. She had an acute coronary syndrome with atypical symptoms, because you have to know that women, prevalently women, have atypical site, atypical irradiation. Sometimes they don't have pain at all. They have only some anxiety, fatigue. I have a patient who went to gastro, so to have a gastroscopy. I have another patient who went to psychiatric department with a heart infarction. So, you know, the typical man who had put the hand on the heart is not the case for women. Very, very rare women have the typical. So this is absolutely not known by ladies, by doctors, unfortunately. Okay, our cardiologists in Italy now, since 15 years, they are working on this, and they are much more good on this. On the other side, heart infarction is the first cause of death of women, but nobody think about this. The first cause of death of women. Look at this. This is the leading cause of death in Italy. Women, for 48%, they die for cardiovascular disease. And while men, for 38%, men are they died more for oncological problems. And this, we arrived to this really not good consciousness, because on the 80s and on the 90s, when we started to do the big epidemiological study on risk factor for atherosclerosis, we didn't put any women in the studies. Look at the multiple risk factor intervention trial, a very, very good international study. We've taken in consideration 350,000 men. And also the first the studies on intervention with drugs as WASCOPs, statins, for example, they didn't take in consideration, but this was 95 till 2000. These works were going on till 2000. And when you go to look to the studies on intervention on disease or cardiological disease, before was on risk factor. This is with drugs. And these are the studies which are still underneath our guideline. You look, the female, the women were very few and with any statistical significance. And this again is the studies who are under the guideline for heart failure. And again, the number of women are not significant to have good result, statistical result. Let us jump to another clinical case that Londa already showed. This is John. He was playing on the knee with the two nephews, and he lost equilibrium. He didn't fall down. He lost equilibrium, and he had a terrific hip fracture. But this guy never did a scan of the bone. And another question is, but if I do a scan, which are the normal values of this scan for men? Because this machine are made by industries, and they are the normal values are standardized on casuistic made by female, 2,000, 3,000 per. And this is important because 50% of men over 60 years have osteopenia or osteoporosis, and mortality after hip fracture is higher in men than in women. And this is another case in the oncology. This is Ada, 64 years. She was feeling guilty because in Italy, every 2 years, we are called to bring the feces to test for blood. But she didn't bring the specimen. So she went to do it, but she was happy because the occult blood in stool was negative. Okay, but these ladies had a very severe cancer on the right part of the colon. And I say this because the cancer in the right part of the colon is much less asymptomatic, and the fecal occult blood become positive really when always things are out of possibility to do. This lady was a friend of mine, has already hepatic metastasis. But in Italy, do you know, colon cancer screening involves fecal occult blood test every 2 years for age 50, 69, and then finished. And somebody can say, but why that? Perhaps we don't have data. Okay, this is a fantastic review article published on 218, where it's very clear written that the women has the right ascending proximal cancer. The mortality is more than higher, that the survival rate at 5 years is late, that fecal occult blood. So we had already in 18 material to make the big review article. Urgent need then to review screening program. Absolutely urgent need. I jump to another specialty of medicine. This is psychiatric, and this is a man again, 53 years man, and his wife was telling us that he had an insomnia since approximately 6 months. He was silent, he didn't speak very much in the family. These were the two symptoms, let us say, but unfortunately, this guy committed suicide by hanging himself in the garage after taking his son to school. And I underline this because symptoms that we normally look for depressed, they're not appropriate for men. Depression in men is absolutely underdiagnosed. And I show this women are more depressed than men all over the world. But suicide, look at the blue bar, how higher it is. This is the suicide all over the world. I cannot see because it's too little, but in the Mediterranean, Europe, Americans, everywhere. So this is another specialty of medicine. And geriatric has this problem, the dementia. Gina at 72 started to have cognitive impairment with quick progression to dementia, and she died at 92, 20 years in a family, very well looking, with a very good family till 92 years. And 2/3 of demented old people are women. And you know, the risk factor for dementia between men and women are different. There are some biological factors. If there is some doctor here, I say only epsilon-4 protein is much more strong in female than in male. So it's not only because women become older than men, but there are really big differences. And I will stop a little longer on COVID to show to you really how different we are. Maria, 70 years old, their husband and Maria and Agostino, they both had in 20, not yet vaccinated, COVID. Maria, 70 years old, fever for 3 days, while Agostino, 72 years old, 10 days in intensive care unit and 20 days internal medicine. He has a very important respiratory failure and acute renal failure. Okay, I go a little deeper on this just to show to you how also from biological, immunological point of view, we are different. The fatality rate, this is in Italy, was much with more mortality, fatality rate in men than in women from 50, age of 50. At the end of the life, there are more women over 90, so there are a little more also died. And this is all over the world. You see, the blue are the mortality for men, and the rose is for women. And the mortality was in all over the world much higher in men than in women. And why? So I go through first, women follow the rules better than men. Okay, this was demonstrated by everybody in the world. But there are other biochemical differences. I like to show to you first. The SARS-CoV-2, the viruses, enter to the cell throughout a receptor called ACE2. When it enters with this receptor, the receptor and the virus are inside the cells, and there is a mechanism very well known for all receptors that block the synthesis of the receptor itself. So this way, stop. This is a good way to go inside. It's better, let us say. The other one is throughout a protein, membrane protein, transmembrane protein serine 2, and this bind the spike protein of the viruses, enter inside and enter continuously without stop, without regulation. Okay. This is more expressed, the ACE receptor is much more expressed in men, in female, and the TMPRSS2 protein is much more expressed in men. And ACE2 is encoded by the X chromosome in the X chromosome inactivated, in case I don't like to make too difficult. And on the other side, estrogen stimulates ACE2. So this is a big advantage for female. On the other side, TMPRSS2 is induced, the expression is induced by androgen. And this was also demonstrated by a person with cancer, prostatic cancer, treated with androgen inhibitors. And on the other side, this was biochemical mechanism, the immunological system of women are much more stronger. The innate and adaptive immune response is much stronger in female than in males. And in addition, estrogen has anti-inflammatory effect and testosterone are immunosuppressive effect. So you understand how all mechanisms, biochemical, immunological mechanisms are much heavier on men than on women. And this can be an example. I took only the example of COVID, but we can go through all the cases I've presented before to see a lot of mechanisms as the one I've showed to you now. And I like very much this paper on public on nature for us. Nature is a very important paper where it is underlined that there is a huge consequence to having two X chromosomes versus X and Y, because it is not only a question of hormones. X and Y's are crucial for all kinds of metabolism. Cellular sex may also help to explain why women may have different susceptibility to all kinds of disease. And I show always this nice paper on cell death diseases published by some Italian people where they demonstrated that cell under stress, the male cell suicide, the female resist. So there are a lot of difference at the molecular level, cell level, and so on. And NIH was before also said by Londa, recommendation since 2011 said monitor differences and similarities for all human disease that affect both sexes, promote research on gender difference at cellular level, study gender differences since the cradle, but not only in the United States, but also in Europe, these three recommendations were not followed. So this is the reason I say that gender medicine does not exist. And my chair on gender medicine had a significance for few years, but nowadays we don't have anymore, fortunately, because it has no sense. Gender medicine like that does not exist. Why? I think it's obvious. We have seen cases, clinical cases on orthopedics, cardiology, oncology, rheumatology, pharmacology, psychiatry, and you can go the intrauterine life, the surgery, the organ transplants, the devices, all the devices. And then otorhinolaryngology, the occupational medicine, all kind of specialties, medical specialties have difference. So I like much more to speak about gender-specific medicine. Till will not be enough grown up to don't say anything. To otorhinolaryngology should be gender-specific, organ transplants should be gender-specific. But now I think we will need some decades to say gender-specific of all specialties. Gender medicine involves all branches of medicine, and we have to move from the concept of gender medicine to sex and gender-specific medicine that are two things a little different. But of course, I cannot today speak about this. All medical specialties are involved. if otherwise we create a parallel street. And on the right, we will find only female doctors. On the right, on the left, on the right, you will see only male doctors. Female doctor with a kind of feminist also spirit that sometimes ruin a little. It's good, but sometimes in front of men ruin the story. Research is advancing rapidly. This is really a good thing. Look, since I started before, it was already in 1999 when I started, but in these 20 years, look at the PubMed, the Web of Science, how many publication increase as gender and as sex. Cardiology is the first. And also oncology, fortunately, and also immunology now is going up very well. Where are we in Italy? Well, I see in Italy, we have a very good network that we have created in the last 15 years. I don't show to you all these boxes. We have a good newsletter in Italian language, unfortunately, but we have also a very good paper, journal, founded in 1915, and it was in the Italian Journal of Gender-Specific Medicine, and now we have moved on Journal of Sex and Gender-Specific Medicine. Very quickly found if you put in Google this name, it's all in English. And we have a law. And this is make a difference. Since 2018, there is a law on gender medicine. And how can this law be diffused and applied? It can be diffused and applied because we have a fantastic plan for the application and the diffusion of the gender medicine. And this was signed, approved by the Ministry already 19. And since a few months, we have a national training plan signed by the two ministers of health and of research and university. And this plan, this national training plan, underline how gender-specific medicine has to be disseminated, and the providers are the university, the regions. In Italy, the regions are the hub of healthcare system, the scientific society, the professional association, the health and care professions council, the scientific foundation, and all recipients should be students from all kinds of sanitary course, postgraduate training, university staff, healthcare workers. And this is a big, big work that we have in front of us for National Health Service and all universities. Just to conclude, the law, the dissemination plan, and the training plan are for us a revolution. It's a revolution for national health system, for the region, for the university, for the medical council, for the scientific society that are the society who makes the guidelines, for the research institute, for pharmaceutical industry. They are afraid, the pharmaceutical, that we could change the guideline, and that's the budget and or regulatory agency. So gender-specific medicine is a revolution for daily medical practice, is a scientific and ethic duty for all medical specialties. In Italy is also a legal duty now. And when I stop on this kind of picture all over the world, I like to say also that whenever there are gender differences affecting physical, mental, and social health on the individual and of the population in the world, this is gender-specific medicine at world level. It's a duty for all of us and for all countries. Last, gender-specific medicine is just a must, absolute must, a scientific, ethic, moral, and social and political at global level, since it takes care of everything that alters our humanity and our physical and mental health as men and as women, and in Italy is also a law. I thank you for the attention, and with our Congress that we had in 22 in September, the International Congress on Gender Medicine here in Padua, and it was a very good moment of our life, medicine life in Italy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Giovannella, for the wonderful paper. I think that we have time for just for a couple of questions. If someone would like to add a comment, a question. Otherwise, just a reflection, Giovannella, because starting from Londa previous paper that she mentioned about the transgender people, I know that among gender disparities, transgender health issues is emerging, and one of the most critical, at least in the last few years. What is your opinion on that?
I think that is one problem that belongs to the gender differences, and it has to be taken into account more simply also, because the problem is very high in Italy. We have some number a little over 5%. Just a work not yet published but finished a month ago has described 7.5% of not recognition on own gender in Italy. This is enormous problem. So I think that this is a problem that belongs to medicine, then to gender medicine, then to gender specific medicine. It has to be, but not that, since I know the cardiology, the cardiological difference, I know everything about transgender. If you go in the website of our Istituto Superiore di Sanità, National Institute of Health, you will find a very good website inside on all the problems. And this afternoon, there is also a meeting on this problem, problem from Rome, where I have to attend.
Another question? If not, the time is running over, so we move to the next section. Thank you again to Giovannella.
Thank you, Annalisa, and organizer. So it's a pleasure to introduce Elena Gissi. I will do this very briefly because we're running out of time. So her presentation concerns sex analysis in marine biology, insights and opportunities for effective conservation in a changing climate. Elena Gissi is a senior researcher at the National Research Council Institute of Marine Science in Venice, and also she's been visiting scholar at Stanford University, Hopkins Marine Station in the USA. In 2020, she was awarded a prestigious Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellowship by the European Commission for a project titled MEDICS, Marine Environmental Dynamics and Sex-Based Analysis for Climate Change Adaptation in Marine Spatial Planning, for which she's been working, and she is working with Professor Fiorenza Micheli and Professor Londa Schibinger. The research that she's carrying out focuses on understanding and modeling the responses to climate change of marine life at multiple levels of biological organization to incorporate this knowledge in marine management for adaptation and mitigation of climate change. I will stop here, just mentioning that Elena Gissi has published over 40 peer-reviewed articles in the field of research. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Claudia.
Ti avviso quando mancano 2 minuti ai 20.
Allora, thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad and honored to talk to this audience. For my talk, I would like to give a perspective on incorporating sex in marine biology research. First, I will give you a context about the importance of preserving the ocean for all the benefits we derive from it, and I will argue about the importance of incorporating biological sex and sex analysis for climate change adaptation and mitigation. So let me start with some background. So the ocean has been envisaged as the new economic frontier to offer space and resources for human well-being. This goes under the term blue economy. For blue economy, we intend all the economic activities that are related to the ocean with established and emerging sectors. With the Sustainable Development Goal number 14, the United Nations aim at conserving and sustainably using the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development, meaning that blue economy should happen by sustainably use marine resources and maintain ecosystems in an healthy state so that the system is able to provide multiple benefits for all of us. Supporting marine ecosystems and their conservation is particularly critical in the age of climate change. Climate change is considered as a key driver of change for marine ecosystems, affecting their resilience and functioning. So climate change is manifested by ocean warming, acidification, sea level rise, and is impacting marine biodiversity at multiple temporal and spatial scales, from individual organisms to communities of species and ecosystems. A key challenge in marine biology and ecology is to understand the response of marine organisms to multiple stressors, including climate change. In fact, effective strategies for reversing the loss of biodiversity rely on robust knowledge on how marine organisms, populations, and communities respond to environmental change. I argue that sex analysis provides opportunities for innovation and for advancing our understanding of how marine biological systems respond to climate change. For sex analysis, sex analysis is defined as the process of incorporating biological sex considerations into research design and analysis. In sex analysis, biological sex of target organisms is integrated not only as a covariate into experimental treatment, but as a factor that can influence or confound the research design, analysis, and interpretation of the results. And in biology and in marine biology, sex describes differences in sexual characteristics within living organisms that go beyond their reproductive functions and affect appearance, physiology, behavioral, and metabolic systems of organisms, and reflects then in the behavior of populations and the relations between different species. What is the problem? In marine biology, however, sex is often overlooked in laboratory experiments, investigating, for instance, the response of a variety of marine organisms to ocean acidification and temperature increase. In the broader field of biological sciences, recent studies have addressed the role of sex in research, but only on mammals. So the extent to which sex-based differences are explicitly addressed across taxa, species, and community has not been examined. So why is this important? What are the implications of this lack of knowledge? So these knowledge gaps have important implications for environmental management. If we take, for instance, fisheries, fishery management may fail to achieve sustainability if sex-based differences, for instance, in stock assessments, so in the state of populations of the fish we eat, are ignored. Fisheries, for instance, that catch large individuals may de facto target females in species where females mature larger than males. So disproportionately high mortality among large fecund females can significantly decrease stock productivity. Thus, ignoring sex could have unintended negative consequences for marine population and can also bring to ocean management unintended negative consequences in ocean management outcomes. So with my Marie Curie, I reflected on the challenges of including sex analysis in marine biology and specifically answered the 3 research questions. So what is the role of biological sex in marine biological processes? Why is sex analysis crucial for conservation in response to climate change? And what are the methodological approaches and experimental techniques for sex analysis? To answer to these questions, I've applied a qualitative literature review to depict model studies of sex analysis in marine biology research. Of all the studies in our pool integrated sex into research design and examined the sex-specific differences predominantly at organisms and population levels. Sex influenced, as I said, physiology, morphology, behavior, and foraging strategies of individual organisms, but less, for instance, is studied about movement and distribution patterns of organisms. And none is studied at community level. And if you consider community level is the level at which we produce policies and strategies of conservation of marine organisms. Very importantly, the large majority of studies testing sex has found sex-based differences. So the other important result is that the sex-based differences has been studied across a lot of taxa, basically all of them. So testing sex have brought to find sex-based differences. Sex is also crucial in conservation to climate change because there are sex-specific responses of marine organisms to climate change. For instance, climate change can influence sex determination of species. For instance, changing temperature have induced female-skewed populations in sea turtles. Climate change can also differently affect marine organisms because of sex-based factors. For instance, sex-specific survival rates in sea lions. Marine organisms can also differently respond to climate change because of sex-based factors, as what was observed for some seabird species that segregate spatially between sexes. So what if our models were blind to these mechanisms? Let me bring another example. When studying population dynamics, a bioenergetic model for 4 seals distinguished energy intakes between individuals at different life stage and according to the annual life cycles. Lactating females are central foragers, meaning that they have to go back to rockeries to feed their pups. Trip duration of lactating females is a key parameter to understand foraging efficiency and pup survival rates, and indeed population survival. The distance to shore and trip duration is related to prey availability. So imagine that climate change will induce a shift in prey populations, as we already have evidence for this. So what about the foraging efficiency and success of lactating females? Adult males can move freely and spend more time foraging at sea, while females have to go back because their pups have a certain time of survival without feeding. So these are the kind of climate-induced changes that can affect individual and population life and can influence species and communities at the scale we do ocean management. So we need to understand why sex and sex analysis have been overlooked in conservation and ocean management. There are biological and logistic challenges in understanding sex-specific dynamics of marine organisms. I bring here another well-known example of a well-studied species, sea turtles. So adult females represent the class of individuals that have been most studied in their movements because they can be easily tagged and equipped with satellite transmitters during the nesting process, because female nest ashore. Less is known about adult males because they never come ashore. They are difficult to harvest and to catch in the vast space of the ocean. And less is known about the hatchlings and juveniles because they leave when they are very small. So this is a very critical under climate change because understanding the male component of sea turtles is critical to find solutions against the increased number of females that are being produced because of the increase in temperature. Another problem is determining sex in field experiments. For some animals, sexual dimorphism is evident, but for many others, it is not. Plus, being monomorphic doesn't mean that there are no differences in behavior of foraging strategies, for example. So determining sex may be costly, invasive, and time-consuming. In many cases, whether determining sex is methodologically possible, sampling organisms of both sexes can be logistically challenging, as in the case of wide-ranging species. So with my research, I have synthesized a series of methodological approaches for sex analysis in marine biology, and many of these questions can be applied to biological research because research questions between terrestrial ecosystem, freshwater systems, and terrestrial systems are many times very similar. So I pose these questions and I provide examples of design approaches that can be used, can be applied by scientists. These are all published. I just want to give some examples about what define the field of biological research. So the collection of data in field research. Because with data disaggregated by sex, then researchers are able to consider sex as a covariate in subsequent research phases. So researchers have addressed how to collect data and how data collection in the field can result in skewed sex ratios of surveyed organisms or of collected data. For instance, skewed sex ratio in data can depend on sex-specific biological mechanisms or sex-specific selectivity of data collection techniques. For instance, in this study of white sharks of the Californian coast, this group of scientists speculated that the higher numbers of observed older males might depend on higher mortality of younger females, or a smaller numbers of observed females due to differences in behavior. But how to answer to this question? So by innovatively combining detections from acoustic tags and photographic identification, the same group of researchers found that sex-specific patterns in migration of white sharks resulted in a disparate capture probabilities between males and females, which affected the observed sex ratio. So these results suggest that the higher number of observed older males reported previously likely result from differences in behavior between males and females, and not on higher mortality on females. Another approach to robustly include sex and sex analysis in field studies requires determining potential sex bias in existing data sets. For instance, data collected through fishery-dependent surveys can be biased toward females or males, depending on species and fishery types. For instance, in this highly dimorphic snow crab in the Eastern Bering Sea, females that are smaller than males have no commercial value, so they are not represented in fishery data sets. So to study the population dynamics of these species, a group of scientists used data collected by the annual Marine Fisheries Service bottom troll, so in combination with fishery surveys, so to have a complete data set representing females and males. So I just want to give a few suggestions about how to integrate sex analysis in biological research and what we can do as scientists, as funding agencies, and as decision makers. As researchers, we can, for instance, disentangle or answer to specific research questions. As I showed before, there is much to know about the interaction between sex and climate change, because not necessarily species where there are no differences between sex will respond in the same way to climate change. So this has to be disentangled. Other questions that I'm working now on is about understanding how individuals, sex-based differences at the individual level might change the behavior and of communities to how species interact among them. Another important aspect is technology, because this is not easy to be done, but there are a lot of methodological and logistic challenges, but technology can help us and can give opportunities for doing so. I just want to mention some examples on how, for instance, genetic techniques can help sex determination. And so that the developments in understanding genetic markers, sex-specific genetic markers, can help in sex determination of different organisms. Here I take the example of the use of drones to collect blow snot from whales have produced an improvement in knowledge about whales. Basically, the scientists, what they did, they mounted some Petri dish on drones so that they can collect the snot. And with this information, with the snot, they can determine, first of all, the sex. They can give us an information of the pregnancy status and so on. Funding agencies can support basic research and sex-based differences. This is very important because research about details of sex-specific differences is not published in first quartile journals. That means that academic and researchers are not, let's say, pushed in a way from the system in which we work to produce this very specific, fine, detailed knowledge. But this knowledge is essential if you want to counteract climate change and arrive to decision makers. Decision makers can work on introducing sex, for instance, in the monitoring protocols, but also in revising the criteria that we identify, we use when we want to establish, for instance, new marine protected area. And I want to finish with this example. So imagine that there are some species that segregate spatially by sex because of increasing temperature. So what if we place and we locate a new marine protected area without this knowledge? We risk to have, again, an unintended effect of protecting the area, which is important for a sex and not for the other. So I want to conclude by thanking my supervisors at Stanford and at CNR, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Elena, for a very clear, very inspiring presentation and for sticking with the time perfectly. So we do have a few moments for questions. If anyone would like to intervene.
Okay, the question is about what scientists can learn from their own research in their involvement in sex analysis. I think, yes, a specification. Okay. It's a very interesting point because many scientists think that they consider sex because they, let's say, frame sex as reproductive biology. And so they say, I don't do reproductive biology, and so I don't need to include sex. But then, like I've seen with my experience, for instance, in a laboratory of community ecology, there are all different kind of, for instance, sampling activities that gives results that are biased by sex. And researchers need to question why they, for instance, catch more males or females, because the aim of our research is to describe the world and to understand the mechanisms so that we are not only understand, but we can manage and we can support how to manage these systems. So there is some routines in biological research that we take for granted many times. So for instance, many times there are laboratory studies that just don't include sex because scientists don't think about the importance that it might have. I remember a colleague that at the end of the experiment, she just sacrificed the organisms she was working with. So she had an opportunity to include sex to understand if the response variable she was studying was somehow related to sex or not. But she just didn't think about checking the sex of the organisms she had. So she missed an opportunity. And now with the climate crisis we are in, we cannot lose opportunities anymore, because we might miss the point of we want to represent a world that works differently from what we think it works. For instance, as I showed the last example, if I don't have this knowledge, if I don't include this knowledge, I might fail in protecting the environment. And with the challenge that we have to face climate change, we might miss the capacity to manage properly. So I would say, even in the review process of the paper that we were writing, we discussed with many reviewers, and some of them, for instance, one scientist in population dynamics, he told us, I suppose it was a he, but I don't know actually, that for him, he used sex as a routine in his practice, but in his everyday life, in everyday work. But he told us, this is very important because I see more and more colleagues that don't use that. And the same problems that you have, for instance, when you do experimental studies, you have when you do, for instance, in ecotoxicology, and the importance of having sentinel organisms, model organism responding to ecotoxicological studies. For instance, sometimes we use the response of these organisms to understand if compounds are toxic for us, if the environment is toxic. And sometimes this response can be sex-specific, but the fact that we don't have baseline studies on the sex-specific response to the signal, we might confound that response as a response deriving to a compound. So we have plenty of examples, and each scientist should start answering these questions for plenty of innovation that we can find in all these disciplines. I didn't mention what Londa mentioned, but now in Nature, every paper, any study about life sciences, they have to report how they treat gender and sex, and if they don't, why, and make it very transparent so someone else can take up this challenge.
Can I ask, Elena, you opened up by showing something that relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. So that is like the broader framework within which your analysis is being conducted. And it seems to me that there is a big effort at the level of the international community that not often is taken up by the states, maybe, to do as much in relation. And it's very hard to find agreements on everything that relates to climate change and the environment. But I was wondering to what extent in the international sphere that is not strictly related to academia and research, these issues are welcome. So to what extent, if we look at COP conferences, these kind of issues are also presented, because as a socially engaged researcher, I think for all of us, that remains an issue. How do we channel these messages in those spheres where, a global discussion is happening? What is your take?
I would say we face the same challenges as scientists. This is very tricky because it involves subjective biases, I would say, with respect, like when I present my research, I'm very careful in not ever mentioning gender, for the same way of not ruining the perception of what I'm doing, which is, this is good science, is a good representation of what's going on. It's not about any, I really appreciated the comment of Professor Baggio about that. I don't want to ruin the discourse, because this is for facing climate change crisis. So I try to connect with people that might support these arguments and this science and these approaches as much as possible. So trying to find entry points to open up the discussion. I had a good feedback, for instance, from FAO, from fishery, so food agriculture organization, because, like, for instance, about fishery, it's really how much we can fish and how much we can't. So it's really something that presented and discussed, prioritizing with people that are more open, that can, like, it's more like really, it's like finding the good leverage points as entry points.
Thank you. That still requires lots of communication strategy, although, right? So maybe we can continue the conversation over coffee break, which is served open to everyone in the Basilica, just outside. And we will resume, I think, Annalisa, 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Okay, so we're coming back here at 11:40.
It's a pleasure for me to introduce Anne-Sophie Godefroy. She is associate professor at University Paris-Est Créteil and researcher at République de Savoie, a joint transdisciplinary research unit of the École Normale Supérieure, PSL, the CNRS, and the Collège de France. Her research interests are philosophy of science, science studies, women and gender studies, epistemology. We were partner of the FP7 European project Gender Time from 2013 to 2016. We did the opening meeting of the project in Padova, just in this room, do you remember? In this talk, she will address the problem that gender equality policies specifically target at the younger researcher are the blind spot of gender equality policies. The high level of mobility and diversity of status partly explain this lack, as well as the contested definition of young researcher. The talk will deal with the experience she is doing with the cost action voices. We thank Anne-Sophie for having accepted our invitation here. And the title of the talk is Making Young Researchers' Voices Heard for Equality, a key issue for the future of European research. Please.
First of all, thanks, Silvana and Annalisa, for inviting me. It is always a pleasure to come back in Padova, where I came first for the Gender Time project, good old times. So today I will present the Voices Cost Action. The full title of this cost action is Making Young Researchers' Voices Heard for Gender Equality. What is the overall context? So we know young researchers are the future of research because they will be the future researchers simply when we will be retired. And we also know that gender equality has been highlighted in European Union policies. However, even if many intersecting inequalities originates in early career stages, as it has been demonstrated by Murgia and Poggio, gender equality policies specifically aimed at young researchers are the blind spot of gender equality plans and many gender equality policies. And one explanation may be the fact that in many cases, young researchers are not employees or not visible and permanent employees of institutions. And so the institutions are not very concerned about them. According to Eurodoc, which is the umbrella association of PhD and Young Researcher Association, 1 on 10 PhD candidates will have a position in the university. So it raises a huge question for the 9 others. So in some fields, it's just normal. So if you have a PhD in engineering, most of PhD candidates will never work in academia. They will work in R&D. But in other fields, it's more difficult for them. And 1 on 2 PhD candidates choose mobility for employment reason and not for scientific reasons. So all this discourse around mobility is, it's not just for innovation and good science, but it's also for many other reasons. And so there is a lot to do and to say, and a lot of policy recommendations to make about young researchers. So why are they so invisible? So as we said, so they have a high level of mobility, and most of the statistical data is made by country or by institution. And so it's difficult to track what's going on for individuals and what is the typical career path, if there is one. They also have a diversity of status. So some of them are say junior academics. Some of them are employed by companies to write their PhD thesis. Some of them have a contract. Many of them have a contract connected to a short-term project, 3, 4, 5 years. Many of them are in a precarious situation, and they are invisible in institutional data because of that diversity of status and the fact that it's short-term and very mobile. At the same time, the excellence policies are shaping the early career stages, maybe more than other stages of career, with a lot of project-based contract, lots of competition. You have seen 1 on 10 will get a position in the academia, intensive public pressure for intensive publication, mobility, but also maybe more transparent and international evaluation procedures. So you have the advantages and disadvantages with those excellence policy. And so the Voices cost action is an attempt to try to document this situation and to make policy recommendation. So Voices is a cost action. What is a cost action? Because it took me some time to understand what it was, even after the proposal was funded. So it's not a research project. So that's the main thing you need to understand. It's more like a research network. So practically, Voices is a network of more or less 400 researchers. So it's a network of researchers, not a network of institutions, because in a research project, institutions are partners. Here it is individuals, but with an affiliation to an institution. So we have now around 400 researchers. It is funded during 4 years, from 2021 to 2025. So we are more or less in the middle. We have 36 European countries. So cost countries are not the countries of the European Union plus other European countries, but including Israel or South Africa. So it's a very large Europe. Russia has been banned, but Ukraine and Georgia are full cost countries. So it's larger than the European Union. And among the members, we have 3 people who represent umbrella association
which are at the same time key stakeholders. So the first one is Eurodoc. So as I said, it is the association, the umbrella association of all PhD and young researcher associations in Europe. We have EPWS, the European Platform of Women Scientists, with at least 3 representatives for EPWS. And we have the French Network of Gender Equality Officers called CPED, so that's Conférence Permanente Égalité Diversité in French. So that's, and that's very important for us to have those stakeholders in the project itself, in the action, I should say. So we are connected with other actions, other projects, other associations. So to name some of them, so we are connected with UGAIN, studying gender in artificial intelligence, REMO, which is about mental health of young researchers, Women on the Move, about women refugees and among them, women academics who are refugees, the Marie Curie Alumni Association, what we called in former times the sister project, so all the structural change projects implementing gender equality plans, Horizon projects dealing with gender, and I could name some others. So it's mainly about networking. There is no true resource for research. So there is some grants for short-term scientific missions, money to organize training schools and conference, but no proper resource for research. And it's based on volunteer work. So what you get is what you bring, more or less, that kind of network. And another interesting thing is that it's flexible and open. So it means that any person interested by the topic can join at any moment, which is not the case with a project. So and another characteristic of Voices is that we implement as a cost action, as any cost action, we implement cost policies. So cost policies say that you have a management committee with 2 MC members for country, a chair and a vice chair, working group leaders and co-leaders, that you give specific grants. And what is interesting that you have to try to balance, as an international organization, you balance the leadership roles between young researchers and senior researchers, males and women and men, and also according to countries. Some countries are labeled inclusiveness targeted countries, and the people who are registered within those countries, so it can be their own nationality or the nationality of their institution, benefit of specific grants, or we will give them the priority. So there is a form of intersectionality, if I may say, in the governance of the cost action itself. However, sexual orientation, ethnic origin, or social background are not taken into account by those criteria, and the country, maybe the country of origin, of residence, or of work, but many researchers from ITC countries cannot benefit of this status because they work or live in non-ITC countries. For example, if you're a Greek young female researcher, but you work in a UK university and you declared UK as your country, so you will not be considered as somebody from an ITC country. So the one question raising from the beginning of the action was the definition of young researcher. What is a young researcher? When we wrote the proposal, it was another definition. There was no young researcher at that time, but early career researchers. And the early career researchers were defined as researchers up to 8 years after their PhD. In 2021, COST decided a new definition, and the name is now Young Researchers and Innovators. And the definition is very simple. It is researchers under the age of 40. So the good point is that it includes persons working in R&D and research without a PhD. And the change was made for them, especially for people working in the industry. But it excludes many young researchers who started a second career or are in some disciplinary fields where you are slower than in STEM, or have a non-linear career or specific career dynamics. And so one of our recommendations will be to combine both definitions to include more people. On this slide, you can see the structure of the COST action. We have we are structured into 6 working groups. So the 4 first working group are the 3 European research area priorities regarding gender policies. First is employment, career development, and mobility. The second is leadership and decision-making. The third, gender as a research dimension. And we added to that sexual harassment, gender-based violence, and institutional culture, which is our 4th working group. So that's very easy to identify for people who are familiar with EU research projects. And we added 2 transversal working groups, which are supposed to work with the 4 first working groups, or the 5 other working groups even. So the number 5 is about intersectionality, because as it was explained, so now in the European Union calls, it's not only gender, but also intersectionality and inclusiveness, which are required. So how can we implement that in a European context, where sex, race, and social background cannot be applied, like especially race, because in many countries, race is not even a scientific word, and you cannot collect any data on a systematic basis on that kind of parameter. And even so, for the case of France, if you ask people what they will react very negatively to that kind of question and find it very intrusive and strange. So what are the relevant parameters, and how should we use them in a European context? So that's a big issue. And the last working group is about monitoring and evaluation. So finding the right KPIs, connecting data, and maybe changing methodologies for collecting data, moving towards more qualitative research data collection. So that's working group 6. So let's, yes, and I say in addition, so we have a stakeholders board with all the stakeholders, and especially all the projects I have mentioned, the other actions, policymakers, and so on. So the aims of Voices are to increase the visibility of inequalities faced by young researchers from a gender perspective, to promote a sustainable dialogue between the young researchers and the stakeholders in the research system, and to facilitate a community of gender equality practitioners, researchers, stakeholders across Europe and beyond, with an important participation from COST, so-called inclusiveness targeted countries, or ITC. So that's probably this last aim is probably, to me, it is the most important. So to create that community with people with different background and many people from the inclusiveness targeted countries who are not always very familiar with gender issues in all European countries, but in some countries it's really starting. The expected outcomes, of course, academic publications, as usual, if I may say, so books, specific issues, papers. So at the moment, it's under preparation. So some publications are on tracks and will be there at the end of the COST action. Wide public communication. So there is good communication on the social networks. So if you check gender voices in LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, you will have regular news and some. So I think for students, it's good to have that. And I am preparing a paper in The Conversation, so which is, way of communicating about research for a wider public. We are also connected to policymakers. So we met the European Commission, some members of the European Parliament, and people in the gender unit at DG Research, people, and Pépin, to say things clearly. And we prepare for them policy recommendations and the white book we want to present in 2024. 2024 is also the time of the next European election. So if we manage, we would like to put those questions in the debate, but I'm realistic. I'm not sure it will be the top reason to vote for one list or another. But anyway, and the recommendations for the moment we would like to push. So it's the definition of young researchers. I already talked about that. To have specific measures in gender equality plans aimed at young researchers, because, for example, now if you look at the GARE tool and the series of measures which are recommended, there's almost nothing regarding young researchers. And to see how we can include our topic in current EU policies. So the activities we have, so every year we have a conference and a training school where we share existing research or data. And we also share some exploratory research across the network. And one big activity from now on will be also to prepare future project proposals, because this network is very useful to find partners and to build a consortium. The ongoing activities in the coming months. So we have, next week, we have a training school in Athens on gender as a research content. It is organized by Clemens Stribing and Anita Thaler. And so we will see how young researchers are siding on the injunction to introduce a gender dimension and or an intersectional dimension into research content, and how they renew issues and bring new themes in the research field. How are those dimensions taken into account or not, and in which fields? So in the program, we have 3 streams. It was difficult to define them, but we managed. And so one is health and biotechnology, but it's very wide, of course. Another is digital technologies, and the 3rd stream will be climate, biodiversity, and mobility. So I see that the two communications, at least today, could have been welcome in those streams. For the next year, we have also exploratory research ongoing. So one is a survey on personal life trajectories by Rakibe Kulsur, who is in Austria. So instead of looking at data from the perspective of institutions or countries, as in the SHE figures or in the JEPs, the idea is to have a look at personal life trajectories and see how it is translated into a researcher's life and how it impacts them. And there is another survey on precarious employment status started by Krista Bonello in Malta. So publication in progress, work in progress to update our conceptual framework. There are plenty other topics to explore. I would like to have to know more about mobility and all types of mobility, geographical, of course, but also intersectorial from academia to industry or public and private trajectories, and interdisciplinary. We have some members who have been in the COVID expert group, so to have something specific on the impact of COVID years on young researchers would be also very interesting. There are people interested to study the impact of the excellence, I wrote ideology, but and the new public management on young researchers. Young researchers in JEPs, so the question of dropout and reorientations, the question of gender in young researchers training, which is a huge question because when people applied for the training school, it was obvious that some of them had training and they knew what it was about, and other ones, they never heard about that. And so the application was not relevant because they did not know. Working and living conditions when writing PhD, and if we have time and volunteers, the impact of structural inequalities on gender equalities. So some fields are much better funded than others, and it has an impact on the people in the field, and it's very gendered at the same time. So I think there's something interesting in that direction. What's next in 2024? So our conference will be on gender-based violence and institutional culture. The next training school will be on careers and trajectories. So exploratory research, it's ongoing. The publications, I hope the publication on intersectionality should be ready because it's based on the training school of last summer. So it should be ready at that time. And the preparation of the white paper, and the white paper itself will be also a big thing, and preparation of lots of research proposals. So I finished for those who are interested, of course you are welcome to join. The description is on our website. And you have on the COST website. you need to remember the cost number, because to register, you need the number. So it's 20,137. You register first on the eCost platform, and then you apply to the working group of your choice. And we will go back to get in touch with you, and maybe you can send emails, because it's always difficult to manage this huge network, and it takes time to include all new members. And so once you are in the network, you can engage in existing activities, but you can also propose new ideas. But keep in mind that we have 2 years left, so be realistic. So I will conclude now. So the activities carried out by Voices show that the career and themes of young researchers have been strongly affected by recent changes in higher education, and the contract research, very high mobility, pressure to publish, and all that. And it's more and more difficult to have permanent position at early career stages, and it will probably affect women more than men. So, for example, in France, we are putting in place a tenure track system, which is new. And I'm afraid that it may be very bad for gender equality, but we'll see. We know because it happened in Germany with the Excellence University, and so we know already. On the other hand, internationalization and excellence, tend to make beginning of career more uncertain and precarious. But the development of equality policies and the demand for more inclusive research offer new opportunities in terms of research topic and research careers. So you have good news and bad news at the same time, and it's a little bit paradoxical. So that's yeah.
Thanks, Anne-Sophie, for the description of this experience of a project which is very new for us all. I think that a new definition of excellence needs to take into account the definition of younger researcher, because otherwise we are not fair. It should be interesting to know what is the position of Italian Italy in this
we have many Italian
of younger researchers in Italy, with respect, for instance, to Germany.
We have many Italian researchers, so considered as Italian or with other nationalities, because they work in different countries.
Okay. Okay. There are 1-2 minutes for some questions, please. I don't know. Please.
So thank you very much, Anne-Sophie. I wanted to ask about intersectionality and race. And I understand all the reasons why Europeans do not collect data on race. However, we often use these kind of data to overcome inequalities. And as an outsider, I would say there's plenty of racism in different parts of Europe. So do you think governments will change this, or will we still have no data on race or ethnicity, really? There's so much migration now that I'm thinking that this is an important issue. So I'm really interested in your answer.
Yes, I think that in fact, we don't need race to do intersectionality, because we can use nationality or nationality of the grandparents. So it has been made in some French studies on on migrant people, and to identify them, so the nationality, and I think you can do already a lot within the existing legal frame if you use nationality, age, eventually the nationality of parents or grandparents. And so we should not focus too much on changing the legal frame. And we should do research with what we have, which is not that bad after all. But the problem is that very often the different data sets are separate and you cannot cross the different dimension. If I take the numbers I have we have a social report for all universities, almost everywhere in Europe. And in this social report, you have the data, the sex disaggregated data. You have also tables by age, and sometimes age and gender are crossed, but not always. And you have also the staff and the students by nationality, from Europe, by continent sometimes. And so but it's very difficult to cross the different data sets. And you have so privacy issues. So very quickly you come to very small numbers and people are very easy to identify. So that's, but I think we will, and then we need to see what is meaningful for a given question. So that's the other, but people are working. Another big problem with, not big, but when you cross all the dimension and you have small numbers, you cannot have a statistical approach, because to have a statistical approach, you need large numbers, so which is another methodological limitation. But I think we are progressing and we will make it.
So, are there any other questions? One more question from young people? No. So,
paper.
Sorry, I translated from Italian. So if you can say something about that quickly, and who's working on it, and what kind of expectations actually are behind it.
So we're working on it mostly with Eurodoc, because Eurodoc is already embedded in many European institutions designing European policies for research. And we try to change ongoing policies or existing policies. For example, there is the fact that all institutions receiving European money must have a gender equality plan. So we would like to have a specific chapter on young researchers in gender equality plans, so to add it. Or there is the fact that you need to take into account gender and sex in the research content. So you could add that there should be training of young researchers to take into account, or that it should be included in the curriculum. So that kind of ideas. So and then there is the other, to propose something new. So that's more difficult. So I think that we have two strategies. So one is to try to change from the inside, inside the existing policies, what can be added or changed. And the other strategy is to propose something completely new, but for the moment, I have no clear idea of what it could be.
Wait. Thank you, Anne-Sophie, for your intervention.
I said we'd come back to history where we were yesterday, but with a different chronology and a different perspective. I mean, the chronology is different because the research field of the next speaker, Cristina La Rocca, is the history of the early Middle Ages. And also the perspective is different because what we'd like to, we will hear from this contribution is about gender innovations in the historical agenda. So how enter new gender perspective in history changed our questions, our results, our historical agenda in general. And it can certainly be said that history is a field that first, and perhaps if you want more easily than marine biology or medicine, has been crossed by a gender perspective. In the early 70s, and together with the feminist movement, women's history was born and then gradually became gender history. But it must be said that the degree of innovation and change that gender was able to introduce into the discipline of history was just as strong and important as we heard from the other hard science. And we will hear this in a moment with the contribution of Cristina La Rocca, who is full professor of medieval history at the University of Padua. Her research interests concern various aspects of the early Middle Ages and focus on the Italian case in relation to the European context. And an important aspect of her studies is the cross-use of written and archaeological and so material sources. Just few words to mention some of her publication. I only mentioned the last monograph, that is Tempi Barbarici, l'Europa occidentale tra antichità e medioevo, with Stefano Gasparri, Carocci, 2012. And few edited works in gender history has Agire da donna, modelli e pratiche di rappresentazione, Brepols 2007, or La construction sociale du sujet exclu, du 1er au 11e siècle, always Brepols 2019, and finally, 25 ans après, Les femmes au rendez-vous de l'histoire, published by École Française de Rome, 2019. So, Cristina, the floor is yours, and the title of your talk will be Catching the Unexpected, Writing Women and Women Public Responsibilities in the Early Middle Ages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlotta, and thank you to Annalisa and the organizer for having invited me. Thinking about it, the Middle Ages is a very appropriate historical moment to talk about the new perspective proposed by women. In fact, the common notion that one has of the Middle Ages in a vast global horizon is that it is a dark and clerical moment in our history, a time of long regression of civilization that begins and ends with two moments that for a long time seems even devastating. The fall of the Roman Empire in the West in 476, and about 1,000 years later, the great plague epidemic that decimated the European population in the mid-14th century. The very name of the Middle Ages profoundly reflects the meaning of this definition, invented during the 15th century as a long parenthesis of separation from classical culture and its secular values. The humanists themselves were prepared to rediscover and bring back to light classical culture from the darkness into which it had plunged. Although no men or women who had lived between the 5th and 14th century was aware that they were living in the Middle Ages, the definition of the Middle Ages was, from the outset, a definition by contrast, which was progressively enriched by many elements that overlapped one another without interruption. Moreover, the experience that the humanist scholars themselves or their direct ancestors had undergone during the plague epidemic was projected backwards in time as a negative condition stable for 1,000 years. The Middle Ages of monk and priest were thus sterilized into a condition of fixity and immutability. While this characteristic certainly did not stand in the way of historians' investigation of the Middle Ages over the centuries, it should be pointed out the dimension of sharp contrast with both the preceding and the succeeding period was precisely what historians went in search for. The narrative on the Middle Ages were articulated over a long period in the search for the survivals, the elements that were still present as mere legacies of the ancient world, and in the identification of the anticipation with respect to the 15th century, that is, those aspects that, albeit in an imperfect form, would fully characterize the modern age. In essence, an alteration of there still is or there already is, which, however, did not allow for a full understanding of the intrinsic characteristic of the Middle Ages themselves. If the original fixity was articulated first in 2 and then in 3 different chronological periods, the first moment, the one closest to the empire collapse, was found to contain, as if in a toxic condensate, all the elements that sanction its irremediable disaster compared to Rome's glorious past. Again, this was done by clear-cut antithesis that, for the most part, consider only men as the undisputed protagonists of the events of the so-called Dark Ages. The great migration of the barbarians formed the backdrop to this panorama, and it was precisely on the barbarians that research was enthusiastically exercised, all carried out on the sources produced by the Romans, since there seemed to be no trace of sources produced by the barbarians themselves. The barbarians were, the word itself says it, violent, a violence that derived from the almost primordial urge to destroy and kill for no reason. They were victims of simple drives, anger above all. To this was willingly added the content for any form of written culture, which implied, it was saying, the substitution of the meditative values of Otium for the more brutal ones of the exercise of arm to let off steam, precisely. A direct consequence of this was the barbarian favorite environment, the great plains for riding and for practicing war. For this reason, it was repeatedly said, the barbarians hated the cities, which were instead favored by late Romans. Last and finally most powerful factor of opposition, the barbarians were strongly innately pagan and hated the Romans, who were instead mild Christians, at least since the end of the 4th century. And what about barbarian women? Although not many authors were attentive to this aspect, the few considerations that were reserved for them, especially in the history of law, spoke in an almost paradoxical way, either of crushing subjugation, women reduced to objects to be sold and bought, of exalting freedom. The few considerations about women were all framed in a single expression, the woman, if as no further indication were worthwhile. Mute or belligerent, women could naturally neither read or write, nor these activities seems of any interest to them. Only the clerics and the monks, heirs of the ancient written culture, would remain to appreciate and hand down the ancient texts, emphasizing through this very activity their preponderant otherness compared to the laity devoted to wine, food, and the display of their primordial physical needs. This problematic context, which I have outlined so far, seems neither very encouraging nor attractive. This is why, until the 1980s, very few female scholars approached the so-called Dark Ages, and when they did, it was at best to reaffirm their philological skills, their acuity in cataloging manuscript, their ability to challenge their male colleagues on their battlefield, whether in terms of the topic they choose or the question they ask. The women were simply trying to prove that they could become honorary men. Naturally, the low recruitment of women among female medievalists reinforced this. Even today, the field of medieval history is characterized by a very strong male presence. A few figures suffice. Out of 38 full professors, only 8 are women. Somewhat better is the situation of associate professor, for whom out of 79 there are 37 women. But what is dismaying is the newly accentuating disparity for the new entries. 7 women in type A researcher out of a total of 15, and 4 type B researchers out of a total of 12. I was saying that as first, women practice on traditional subjects, the history of law, the history of religious orders, the history of certain great women whose exceptional abilities in government were invariably highlighted, also considered without any specific gender-related qualities. For us, medievalists, early medievalists, a pivot point was undoubtedly the European Science Foundation transformation of the Roman world project. Between 1995 and 1999, European early medievalists were involved in discussion together in thematic panels. The aim was to try to build a common approach beyond national historical narratives, which were very constraining and very diverse, even on completely similar topics. The project had an enormous influence on the design of the subsequent studies because it made it possible to create international networks, to develop further European projects, but above all, its added value was that it brought different women researchers together, allowing us to talk to each other, to get to know each other, exchange data and idea. The fruit of these encounters did not take long to show themselves and to show how many and what new perspective they allowed us to focus on. In the first instance, we looked for where women were, in what sources they appear, and in what way. And what we discovered was that women were everywhere. In addition, considering a fairly long chronological span from the 5th to the 11th century, it became clear that the presence of women was more intense even in public space until the 6th century, to gradually decline and then reappear again from the end of the 9th until the 11th. This made possible to focus on an important point, namely that gender difference, far more important than ethnic differences, made it possible to focus on specific moments in which the female presence was crucial for the transmission of heritage, for the construction of family memory, but also for the construction of public authority and legitimacy. A first moment, the one traditionally linked to the fall of the Roman Empire, had in fact, quite unexpectedly, valorized from a material point of view women objects, their burials with grave goods. Archaeological evidence and funerary epitaphs spoke clearly. A father who lost a young daughter was becoming socially a nobody, and the family was basically obliged to show that they could survive to this loss, showing their capacity to waste by placing in the girl's grave precious objects that would never be lost, that will never be recovered. At the same time, it became clear that the proclaimed barbarian invasion were only archaeological witnessed by female objects. In which sense they could one think of a sudden movement of entire people where the only trace was precisely that left by women, ideste of a group that did not belong to the army at all? This observation led us to rethink the dimension of the so-called invasion as a phenomenon much more similar to today's migration, that is, of small groups moving to places where they already knew they could find resources. And it then became clear that the barbarians considered it crucial to insert themselves within the empire through their participation in the ranks of the army, and also by entering into marriages with local women who constituted a strong link with the new territories in which they had settled. Marriages between Roman women and soldiers of barbarian origin were therefore one of the most important points for the constitution of new local societies, which could be observed at every social level, from soldiers to generals. The resulting society was not the one imagined by historians of the past, rigidly divided into closed groups, different in terms of custom and ethnicity, but instead a society whose equilibrium was in the process of being defined, and which had precisely in the wealth of women, of land and movable objects, an important local anchorage point. But what were marriages? Did the often propagated idea that Christianity had imposed a rigid and fixed mode from above, contrary to divorce, correspond to the truth? Here too, we had to profoundly reconsider. Until at least the 8th century, there was in fact neither the idea of a conjugal couple, nor that of an ecclesiastical ritual, let alone common landed patrimony. In profound continuity with the Roman world, marriages were structured on different levels of publicity and were above all an affair between family. And to mark the change of authority to which women were subjected after marriage, they normally placed a veil on their head, which, as St. Paul tells us in his first letter to the Corinthians, was the symbol of marital authority. The female life cycle, in fact, included from a very early stage a transfer from the paternal home to that of the husband, which was visually marked by the veil covering the hair. It is interesting to note that, on the other hand, women who remained unmarried in their father's house had their own specific group identity, which, at least in Italy, was in capillo, id est, bare-headed women. The link between visible hair and the natural authority of the father, the veil, and the husband authority are elements that characterize many Mediterranean societies. It was only in the 9th century, following political reflection on the control of the practices of the elite, that the married couple was theorized as the basic cell of society, as a consortium marked by common goods and shared responsibility for children's education. It was also theorized that marriage should last forever, even after the death of one of the spouses. But it is not difficult to understand that profound contradiction between these two diametrically opposed demands. It was also theorized that it would no longer be possible to marry between blood relatives, and that any marriage between individuals related by blood within the 7th generation would be invalidated. Again, it was really useful to observe how this restriction on the choice of the bride was only apparent. In reality, just such a delimitation allowed a very remarkable series of lawsuits to invalidate one marriage brought by men, but also by women, who suddenly said that they had realized that their wife or their husband was in fact distantly related to them, so they can divorce. Observed through these eyes of women, Carolingian marriages were, yes, more definitely regulated, but without giving up the privilege of having many wives and many children, a symbol of male aristocratic wealth and distinction. The discourse on the family, on male and female roles within it, was a political discourse in which the private dimension was inextricably linked to the public one. Certainly, the clerics were very interesting in controlling and regulating these realities, but the deep interconnection between the secular and ecclesiastical dimension in many aristocratic families did not allow this society to be analyzed according to a rigidly binary system. The last point I want to dwell is that on lay literacy. Contrary to what was initially assumed, lay people highly valued literacy, which was by no means the cultural heritage of a small group of clerics. Literacy was, in fact, first and foremost a tool for governing and was indeed considered a specific skill of official, judges, notaries, who created a professional Latin quite different from the one they themselves used to compose narrative and poetic texts. A Latin with only 3 cases used to draw up sales and donation, judicial minutes, papers of practice, in short. But the real frontier was to try to understand whether women, at least aristocratic women, participated in disability and interest. Whether women knew how to write, knew how to read, and knew how to compose texts. Again, it was very important to be able to search, to be able to interrogate our texts. And although very few in number, there was no shortage of positive responses. We ask ourselves, why are so many texts anonymous? Why is that in some of them, the dimension of political action linked to the family memory, to the presence of women in a family, is emphasized in a special way compared to texts certainly produced within male contexts? Is it possible to begin to think that there were scriptural production within women monasteries? Much remained to be done, of course, but take it into consideration the rich epistolary production that has been handed down to us between the 8th and the 10th century in a systematic way, allow us first of all to observe that men and women wrote to each other, and that even if the manuscript tradition has undoubtedly privileged male authorial text, the silence of the girls, as it has been now defined, seems to be determined more by the subsequent selection with which the texts have come down to us in the course of time than by an actual impossibility to answer. In short, the gender gaze has made it possible to observe men and women in their continuous interaction and to make the early Middle Ages a much less predictable and much more contradictory historical space than it first appeared. And I am convinced that it was precisely the women gaze, a gaze consciously exasperated by the serial treatment of our written and material testimonies, that together promoted new ideas and sought on previously unexplored space, ready to allow ourselves to be surprised by unexpected and to use this surprise in new ways. Many challenges await us, coming from the US. Was it the Middle Ages that invented race? Is it the study of the Middle Age a space reserved for white people, a racist and warmongering territory? It was again women who asked this question. It's up to us to reply. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Christina, stay there. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. It has been very clear, I think, how the gender dimension contribute to a big renovation of this field of research of the history of early Middle Ages. And so we can open the floor to questions or comments. No one? The younger? Maybe you can.
Grazie per quanto ci ha ricordato del Medioevo. Io sono rimasta stupita del fatto che l'invenzione della razza si collochi nel Medioevo, perché mi ricordo che ero bambina alle elementari, quindi circa 50 anni fa più o meno, al telegiornale della RAI venne dichiarato che non esisteva un'unica razza umana e non più le 3 razze che a scuola mi insegnavano che c'erano, quindi la razza africana, la razza asiatica, insomma. E questo termine oggi, in effetti, da un punto di vista scientifico, forse non andrebbe più utilizzato, secondo la modalità delle persone della mia età, diciamo. Ma come invece che razza, come comunità, perché le comunità sì hanno delle particolarità molto differenti. Queste particolarità della parte asiatica, africana, c'era qualcosa di questo nel termine razza del Medioevo? Grazie.
But as Londa has suddenly remember a few minutes ago, the term and the variation of race is something that is very used and very normal in the public discourse, even by medievalists. Because when I went to the medieval academy conference in Washington, D.C. this year, they were in fact remembering that they were in a way compelled to have to study this problem and to in a way to affront a difference and to consider the problem seen by medieval author. The people living in Africa, it is not possible to imagine them as white people, as very willingly they were considering. And if you study historical sources, hagiography in particular, you can see that the saints coming from Northern Africa were in fact at the very beginning looked at in very suspicious way, and they were called Maori, for example. So if you in this, what I wanted to say is whatever scientists now say about existing 1, 2, or 3 race or the opposite one, the medieval people were interested in this matter, and their vocabulary show that they were. And so the question is, whose Middle Ages? Middle Ages is just for white society, or can we extend it also to a Mediterranean context?
Anyone? Annalisa?
What I'm really interested in your research is the way in which you use archaeology as a route into the Middle Ages. Is this a widespread thing among medieval historians, or is it just a new turn, or what is the situation now? I mean, sometimes I know that historians go for, inscriptions and stuff, and that was the traditional kind of. You went on to the burial sites. What is happening now? Are there new things that will tell us going on, that will tell us what we can learn about men and women in the Middle Ages?
Yeah. The first thing I would like to say is that archaeological sources are new sources. So while the written material is there and exceptional discovery are not expected to be done, medieval archaeology is quite a young discipline. So it is a continuous innovation from that point of view. And so also the evolution of medieval archaeology, both in town and in the rural space, always offers a new perspective. And also the economy, that is one of the most interesting points. The public economy and the places where the public domain was fixed, and the people that was working on those public areas is now one of the most interesting topics. That is, how were this community of Serbs, we can say, living, Serbs, men and women, how was their quality of life, how they were coping with public works. And also another interesting topic on this domain is the labor of women connected with textiles. And so how can you study all data from archaeological, but also from written sources, if you think that women were working for textiles, and you have many examples of that. Thank you, Annalisa.
Thank you. So if there's no question again, okay. Thank you very much to Cristina.
Okay, I'm Maria Giulia Sestito, and I'm here to introduce the last paper of this conference. Francesca Vidotto is a theoretical physicist. Much of her work focuses on the application of loop quantum gravity to cosmology and black holes. She tackles the problem of understanding the quantum properties of space and time in an interdisciplinary way, bringing together the mathematical, experimental, and philosophical perspectives. She studied at the Universities of Padua, Pavia, and Marseille, and she held postdoctoral positions in France, the Netherlands, and Spain. She's a member of the Physics and Astronomy Department and of the Philosophy Department at the University of Western Ontario, where she holds a Canada Research Chair in the Foundations of Physics. She has been active in promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion, and is interested in feminist philosophies of science. She's also always keen to seek opportunities to bring together art and science. And today, she presents a paper titled, "Is Feminism Changing Physics?"
Thank you, Maria Giulia, and thank you everybody at the Center Elena Cornaro. Thank you, Annalisa Oboe, for inviting me, and thank you most of all to all the students for holding up till the end of this long morning. I have to apologize because I don't have a written paper. This is one of the difference between the science culture and the humanistic culture. So, but I hope my presentation will be lively enough, and I hope I will guide you into this question: is feminism changing physics? So, first of all, let's start with the data. You may ask how many physicists, how many women in physics there are. So here you see in general, in the physical sciences, we have something that is above the 40%. So things changes. So the data that I have been showing to you are for the average of different countries. In Italy, we have a bit, we can talk, well, I think that a good number in the Western countries is around 30% of students starting from the undergraduate to the end of the PhD. And so there are differences in the way in which students, female students, choose which path of studies and whether they choose to study physics or not. But of course, even within physics itself, there are subfields, and there, for instance, you can see here there is a predominance. So these are data from the INFN, that is the Italian Institute for Nuclear Physics. And you can see, for instance, here there is a predominance of nuclear physics, but nuclear physics, remember, includes also the application of nuclear physics to medicine, while you have very little people in theoretical physics. So these data are actually not for students, they are data for leaders of projects in the institute, but nevertheless, they are representative of the situation in the field. So first of all, I want to highlight how the choices are cultural dependent. They changes within different cultures. So in a country, it could be that female students choose to do more applied physics because they are told that abstract thinking is not for women, is more for male students. So while maybe doing practical work in the lab could be more appropriate. This is something that my colleagues here at the Padua University were led to think. But maybe you may meet people from different countries. For instance, in Iran, we have a very large population of female mathematicians and female theoretical physicists. And when you confront them about the reason of their choice, well, you are told that abstract work, including mathematics, including theoretical physics, is considered more appropriate for a woman because it's not muscular, it's not practical, for instance, like doing engineering, constructing bridges, and so on. In Italy, you see this, so you have a representation in physics of women that is higher when it comes to applied physics, to history of physics, or didactics. So many young women choose to study physics or choose to study mathematics in general because they have the idea that this could lead to the teaching profession. So choices are country dependent, and there could be some unexpected results of this. So in particular, you may discover the countries that you think are maybe very emancipated with respect to the condition of women are in fact places in which women are not necessarily striving in scientific careers and choosing fields of research like physics and mathematics. An example is the fact that you have more women even in Italy or in places like, as I was mentioning, in Iran, choosing physics, and places like Canada, Germany, or US in particular, UK, are places in which you have less women in those fields. And this is something that I have been experimenting myself when I moved from Italy and then from France to the Netherlands. And I found myself being the only female researcher in a department with 60 colleagues. Professors, PhD students, and so on, were not a single woman. So, of course, so in a sense, we Italians, we like to complain about our situations, but the situations in Italy is not so bad with respect to the presence of women in research and also the presence of women in physics. Of course, there are historical reasons. We had, of course, the first professor of physics, well, the first professor in the world that, by the way, was also professor of physics, Laura Bassi. Those women have provided role models, but I think there is something more. It's not just about role models, it's also the perception of science in society. So, of course, understanding the reasons why there is a certain percentage of women in a given field is a problem that needs to be explained considering different layers. It's a complex question. So I wanted to arrive to focus on the point of this presentation. This question, is feminism changing physics? And traditionally, the question could be tackled in two possible ways. One way is to ask whether there is a distinctive female way of knowing, or whether it's possible to do science as a feminist. And I wanted to cite on this the page of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. That is a resource that I recommend especially to the students, in which you can find a lot of material also on feminist philosophy of science. And of course, so the first option, the idea that there could be a feminine science was the first approach that was considered, and this was instrumental to understand. I read just directly from here. It helped to challenge the idea of science as only a masculine endeavor and focus the analytical gaze on its feminine aspects, such as intuition, collaboration, social networks, and so on. So this idea was challenged in the 80s. Of course, Londa Shibinger was one of the persons who argued in this direction. Here I'm citing two feminist philosophers of science, Sandra Hardy and Helen Longino, who helped to change the question from looking at the distinctive female way of knowing towards asking the question of how can we do science as feminist? And of course, in the moment in which we do this, we open the possibility also to people that are not women and to do science as a feminist. So it's certainly more inclusive and is also something that may gather support. So then, but I wanted to focus on this question of whether it's possible to have a feminist physics. So doing science as a feminist can be defined by a list of desiderata, such as acknowledge values and beliefs in science, explore how values and beliefs affect the perspective that a scientist brings to science, to a scientific problem, being aware, being honest about assumptions, methods, be responsible about language, consider the effects on the environment, consider the way in which we enter in a relation with nature, in the way in which we do science, possibly avoiding the exploitation of nature. And then on the social level, I mean, a diversity among the participants, recognizing the complexity of nature and resist the single cause explanations. So this list, depending on the authors, could be possibly also longer, and you can try to see whether this desiderata could be fulfilled in the context of physics. So in this paper by Blair, well, there are some of these points that certainly can be achieved in physics. For some others, the answer seems to be negative, that it could be difficult to acknowledge values and belief in physics. And by the end of my talk, I hope we will maybe question this. But so this way of thinking is also what is guiding many of the activities concerning women in physics. So here I'm reporting the activities of the international and the workshops that will take place at the next International Conference on Women in Physics. And I think that they are revealing of what people are doing. So you see, this is already the 8th international conference. I think the international conferences have been taking place every 3 years. So now there's been a growing tradition and more knowledge that has been accumulated in this direction, changing the culture of physics, fighting biases, improving the institutional culture, and raising the voices of women in physics. So empowering them and helping them to find their own voice, so through leadership. Of course, there is the question of education that is always present. How do we teach physics? What is the gender coloring that we put into the education of physics? And of course, all these debates are much now are much wider, including intersectional perspectives. So talking about colonization, talking about in the teaching, in particular, in the way in which we teach physics, talking about the decolonization of the curricula, and taking into account all the different dimensions that may be present beside the gender one. Again, I wanted to cite Londa Shibinger to go ahead in this. So feminists tended to make a distinction between getting women into science and changing knowledge. Both are institutional and intellectual problems, and such initiatives should be collaborative efforts, joining the expertise of scientists and humanists. I will come to this later. A word of caution. This was addressed also, this was a question that was raised also in the previous presentation. A word of caution. It is an interesting phenomenon that when feminist insights become mainstream in a science, they are sometimes thought of simply as good science, and perhaps they simply are. This has the effect, however, of keeping things labeled feminist always on the radical fringe. So, inspired by this sentence, I would like to highlight the good practices that are going on in physics nowadays, try to highlight how a critical mass of young female physicists is contributing to change the field and creating new practices, and possibly also changing the research directions themselves. Why is this important in physics? Well, it comes to my mind like you may have heard these kind of things in the popular press about physics results, talking about language comes expressions like reading the mind of God, talking about the God particle, the God equation. And one can ask, why is this appeal to God always there? And this is, I'm just reporting this Twitter exchange because I think it's revealing, where Professor Anna Watts is saying, I think it's a male physicist thing, delusion of grandeur and all that. So I wanted to, so I think I want to, what I would like to highlight with the following examples is that there is a new generation of young physicists, female young physicists who are, well, young again. We were discussing before what is the definition of a young scientist. These are people that are from the PhD, but also people who are now full professors like Anna Watts, maybe people now in their late 40s, almost 50s. And so they are finally in a position of power and they can react to the old narratives about what physics is about. Of course, in the past, all professors, all female professors were often not driving change. So we all know this phenomena of female professors who were conforming to existing male-driven behaviors. But what I'm pointing out is that this was due to the fact that these scientists were isolated female professors in a world that was male dominated. So the idea is that now we are reaching a critical mass in which women can find support, can support each other, and possibly make changes. We have, of course, also examples of wonderful women in physics from the past. Here, for instance, you see Vera Rubin. And I think I wanted to emphasize highlight Vera Rubin because she's an example of those women who succeeded by working on the fringe. What I mean by this is the fact that traditionally women found their way to do science in subjects that were not mainstream. So where there was not so much competitions by the male colleagues, and often these fields were also interdisciplinary ones. So women were finding spaces there. So this is certainly the case of Vera Rubin, who was the first to discover evidences of dark matter. She went into the study of the velocity of rotation of galaxies, because at the time it was not a popular field of research. And she was a woman who was somehow making putting the family first with respect to her work. So, and choosing this kind of research allowed her to carry on her research despite the commitments to the family and so on. But also, it was exactly because of that she was able to make new discoveries. What is happening today is that there are also new fields of research, exoplanets, quantum computing, and so on. Those fields are new, and because of that, there is nowadays a higher presence of young female researchers. And so those are very exciting fields, not just for the new science, but also because these young women are really changing the practices. So I make an example with the quantum revolution. Maybe if you read some popular science, you may have heard about the quantum computing and the revolution that will come from there. You find wonderful networks of women working in this field. They call themselves the Alices because in quantum computing we look at communication between two agents, two observers. One is traditionally called Bob, and the other is called Alice. So the women in quantum computation are the Alices. So one of the things that has been happening in the field is the fact that people, and especially the women there, have been challenging the language that is used. There was this way of referring to quantum computing in terms of quantum supremacy to explain the fact that the quantum computer would be superior with respect to the classical computers. The word supremacy in English is, of course, related to racism, and so in the community, and especially the women in the community, have been advocating for changing the language. Nevertheless, so for instance, one of the other words that is used is the word quantum advantage, even though in the field, the two terms, they are not really exchangeable because they also mean something else. With quantum supremacy, people keep on referring to abstract problems that don't have a concrete realization, while quantum advantage is used more and more to refer to problems that are real real systems that can be studied in the lab. So you see that so the change in language is also it's a change in the perspective of what is interesting to study in the field, looking at abstract questions that are not realized or looking at questions that correspond to real systems. And I wanted to highlight how students, young students, are also doing initiatives in so-called quantum ethics, in the same way in which you have heard about the question of ethics for computer science. So of course, this quantum revolution with quantum computing may bring a new set of new ethical problems, and young people are already addressing them. And again, if you look at the demographic of the people who are activists in this context, I would say that more than 50% are women. Similarly, so when it comes to open science in physics, you see that all the names that are highlighted are often names of women. For instance, just to make also an historical example, the physics community has been one of the first to have an open archive of papers. So since the 80s, all the preprints in physics were made available online. And this is still the system that we use today. But few people know that this system started because of John Cohen, was a physicist, a female physicist, who started to distribute the papers through a mailing list, and her mailing list evolved into the archive. Other examples are women who are starting new journals, new open access, without, by the way, open access, but without having to pay to publish. Journals for the field of quantum information. And in general, so here I am making examples regarding publications, but it's really a larger movement regarding open science. And so, for instance, this year has been named by NASA the Year of Open Science, and the person that is behind this is a woman, gentleman. You can see more initiatives regarding open science, for instance, the one of Alisa Goodman, this seamless astronomy, try to relate infographics infographics for astronomy, connecting data that are freely available with visualizations, and so on. So one can ask, I was showing you the fact that traditionally theoretical physics and in particular particle physics are fields in which you have less women. So I was telling you, okay, quantum computing could be a new field with more women, more young women. What about the old fields like particle physics that were traditionally male dominated? Well, also in particle physics, I think that there is a striving community of activists that is a very diverse community, diverse in their ethno-racial background, nationality, gender identity, career status, and so on. And, but again, I wanted to highlight the very important presence of young women in this community. So this is in particular a network of people in particle physics called Particle for Justice, and they have been, they rised to the news because they made a very famous statement in response to a sexist talk that was presented at CERN a few years ago, but they have also been active, for instance, with supporting the Black Lives Movement and in general supporting the Black and the LGBT community. So, of course, these are people that are not focusing only on gender, but again, my point is that this community has an important number of women that are driving these initiatives. And then there is a whole new question that is the relation between physics and sustainability. And again, this is the question about what is the carbon footprint of the work that we do. And the first point that you can think about is, for instance, the traveling to conferences. But in fact, so this is certainly the highest, the way in which people like me, being a theoretician, contributes to the carbon emission on Earth. But my colleagues who do very costly computational simulation, so simulations, for instance, or other computational heavy physics, they have an environmental cost, because now we understand that the use of these supercomputers is sucking an enormous amount of energy. So there is an awareness that we also, first of all, we wanted to make our computation sustainable, but also we have to ask whether we have to do these computations, whether it's really necessary or not. And talking about this, also there is a question of whether, how do we choose which experiments, especially those experiments that are very large scale, that could be the new generation of accelerator for particle physics, or could be the new generation of telescopes, maybe space telescopes. So those projects have certainly a very high carbon footprint. And again, if you look, for instance, at an article about this that came out on Nature just a couple of years ago, you can see how, again, women are at the front of this kind of reflection. Yeah, just one question, one more thing that regards the image that I am using. So these are the telescopes in Mauna Kea, because when we talk about sustainability, there is also the question of on which land we do our experiments, on which land we construct our new accelerator, on which land we construct our new telescope. And this should be done engaging with the local communities. They very often are native communities, for instance, in the Hawaii, where most of the telescopes of the United States are placed, but also for the other telescopes that are, for instance, in South America or in Africa and so on. So I wanted to highlight again the presence of these women is driving a change, and these women are not shying away from affirming that they are female physicists, female astronomers. They are affirming their identity, and they are bringing, and thanks to that, they are bringing a change. How much time do I have? 0. Okay, I just wanted to make my last point. My last, in five minutes, maybe? 2, in 2 minutes. So I wanted to conclude answering this question. So you may be aware of the point that Londa Schibinger made in his famous book, Has Feminism Changed Science? And the question is, yes, the answer was on the affirmative when it comes to all these different sciences that in which the gender aspect is somehow more evident. Even though I would say that before having the women making the different science, we would not have understood where was the gender dimension. And I think that with physics, we are somehow in a similar situation. And there could be a way in which, just skip this for the sake of time. I wanted to go directly to the next thing. You can ask me about this later, possibly. So I just want to go directly to this. So the point is that I think that our impossibility to think that there could be a gender dimension in physics is connected to a very specific take on philosophy of science. And I think that even that in order to understand this, we can make the point even more clear if we think of mathematics rather than physics. So if we think that mathematics is about discovering structures that are in a Platonic world, they exist independently from nature, and nature is somehow a reflection of these Platonic structures. Well, of course, there is no way in which different ways to do research can discover anything different. But if we believe that mathematics is a form of language, it's a creation of our mind that allows us to create new words, well, okay, in the moment in which we think of mathematics as a creative activity, of course, creativity implies the possibility to bring different backgrounds into the way in which we create. And I think this is true also when we go to physics, when we talk about the laws of nature, what qualify as cause. So different ways to think of what is a law, what is a physical law, may bring us to a different answer to what could be the gender dimension in physics. And I wanted to highlight again that not just in physics, but also in philosophy of physics, there is a growing critical mass of very interesting philosophers who are hardcore philosophers of physics, but they are also trained in feminist philosophy. And in fact, some of them are involved in the creation of the first feminist philosophy of physics conference for the next spring. So I can conclude at this point with the idea that I just want to go and just skip. I just want to skip this and go to the end, saying that I think that it's possible to talk about a gender dimension in physics in the moment in which we understand that physics, in the moment in which we clarify the fact that there could be different philosophy of physics behind this, and some choices in the way in which we think philosophy of physics may open spaces to think about how different diversity, different backgrounds, not just different backgrounds in terms of gender identity, but also different backgrounds in terms of cultural origin or different social environments may lead us to choose different directions, to explore different directions in physics. And I think my time is gone, so I want to stop here.
Okay, thank you. And we have a few minutes for questions or suggestions, comments. Anyone?
Which is only half formed, but we have come a long way in the history of science, and particularly from the second half of the 20th century, we realized that the kind of language of science was the language of men. Even before we knew, but still, we had a lot of proofs that it was like that, and things started to change. And the archives of knowledge, the archives of science started to be reopened. And and the route that you've taken in your research actually proves that the presence of women makes a difference. That's undeniable. The practices change the results. They change the perspectives, change the result, and I'm not sure they changed the content. And I want to ask you specifically this question now. Still, for me as a humanist, it seems, I still think of physics as something that is, particularly your field, as very far in many ways from the real, or from what I can understand. But it is also undeniable that science becomes what human beings want it to be. And the passage that you highlighted in your area actually proves it. We want it to be a different thing. So eventually the actual discipline will be something different. So if I understood you correctly, that's what I gathered from your intervention.
Thank you, Annalisa. Let me react with a point that I skipped. That is the fact that we think of physics as a male activity somehow, or expressed somehow in a male language. But I think that this is just a matter of the quality that we decide to pick up to define a discipline. Because, for instance, if we think that curiosity is a defining property of a scientist, well, they say curiosity is female, right? So science is intrinsically female then. Or again, if you want, what does it make a good scientist? Well, sometimes a good scientist is somebody who has a lot of patience and can stay long hours analyzing details, like these women were used in physics because of their patience to analyze astronomical plates or to make very long calculations. So again, we do a cherry picking on the qualities that we associate with the discipline, because we wanted to understand, we wanted to reaffirm and make reasons for the status quo that we observe in society. But as society changes and as the demographic of a field changes, maybe we can also see how all the different qualities comes and are necessary to the development of a field. Thank you.
There is another one.
Thank you very much for your talk. So it showed that fixing the knowledge, as the European Union says, is not only about fixing the object of research, but it is also a lot about methodologies, epistemologies, and yes. And thanks for showing that.
And more and more of an integration in teams, in a group of work for projects in which you integrate a humanistic and a more technical scientific part in the team. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, it is essential, because many people say, I'm not concerned by these gender aspects because, in my field, I am a specialist of this particle or that molecule. And so there is no gender aspect. But in fact, mobilizing feminist epistemologies or new methodologies is essential too.
Thank you. I think we need to stop here. Thank you all. Thank you for chairing this session.
Thank you for holding till the end.
Thank you, Francesca. So we're closing now. And I think it's been really engaging, fruitful, and highly informing for us all. Thank you to the students who stayed for so long today as well. Thank you for all the participants, Londa, Rebecca, all the speakers, all the chairs, and we'll remember this. And I was wondering whether you would envisage sharing your interventions for a publication, if you're interested, or, you know, we can talk about this, but I would like to keep a memory of proceedings or something different. We can actually talk about it, but I think I don't want this to get lost. I mean, it's been a profitable dialogue. Okay, thank you. See you again.